There is a photograph from 2008 that most people have never seen. It is not from a red carpet or a press junket. It is from a conference room inside Marvel Studios, back when the company operated out of a modest office in Manhattan Beach, California, and the idea of a shared cinematic universe was still, to most of Hollywood, a punchline. In the photograph, Kevin Feige is sitting at a table covered with comic books and concept art, and he is explaining to a room of skeptics why a B-list character named Iron Man could anchor an entire franchise. Nobody in that room knew what was coming. Nobody could have predicted that within 15 years, this operation would generate over $28 billion at the global box office, reshape the entire film industry, launch dozens of interconnected films and television series, and become the most dominant entertainment force of the 21st century. But here is the thing about building something that large, that fast, with that much money, and that many people involved. You do not get to do it cleanly. You do not get to do it without fights, without broken promises, without moments that make everyone involved look worse than they want to look. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is not just a collection of superhero movies. It is a collection of controversies, decisions, betrayals, firings, lawsuits, and public relations disasters that have been papered over by enormous box office returns and genuine cultural impact. And tonight, we are going to talk about every single one of them. Welcome to Quiet Marvel. Get comfortable, settle in, turn the lights down low. This one is going to take a while, and that is exactly the point. If you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these long, quiet, deep dives. Hit that button, get cozy, and let us get into it. The story of Marvel controversies does not begin with a scandal. It does not begin with a lawsuit or a firing or a public relations disaster. It begins with something much simpler and much more revealing. It begins with a casting decision. And to understand why that casting decision mattered so much, you need to understand what Marvel looked like in 2007, before any of it worked, before anyone had used the phrase cinematic universe without irony, before the idea that superhero movies could dominate global culture for 2 decades straight was anything other than a fantasy. Marvel Studios had just secured financing to produce its own films independently for the first time. No more licensing characters to other studios and hoping for the best. No more watching Sony make Spider-Man films or Fox make X-Men films and collecting a check while someone else controlled the creative vision. Marvel was going to do it themselves. And the very first bet they placed was on Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark in Iron Man. That itself was a gamble that could have gone catastrophically wrong, given Downey's well-documented history with substance abuse. But that is a story about a gamble that paid off. The controversy came with the second most important casting decision in that film, Terrence Howard as James Rhodes. Howard was, by several accounts, the highest-paid actor in the original Iron Man. Not Robert Downey Jr., Terrence Howard. Consider what that means for a moment. The man playing the supporting role was paid more than the man playing the lead. The reason was straightforward. When Marvel was courting Downey, he was still considered a risk. His insurance costs were high. His asking price was suppressed by years of personal turmoil. Howard, on the other hand, was coming off an Academy Award nomination for Hustle and Flow and was considered a safe, bankable addition to the cast. Marvel needed Howard's credibility to help sell the film, so they paid him accordingly. Some reports suggest Howard earned around $3.5 to $4.5 million for the first Iron Man, while Downey earned roughly $500,000. The exact figures have been disputed over the years, but the general picture is consistent. Howard was paid a premium because he was the safer bet. Then Iron Man opened in May of 2008 and made $585 million worldwide. Robert Downey Jr. became the biggest movie star on the planet overnight. And suddenly the math changed. When it came time to negotiate for Iron Man 2, Marvel wanted to reduce Howard's salary significantly. Some reports say the offer was as low as $1 million, a fraction of what he had earned for the first film. Howard has claimed publicly that Downey was supposed to advocate for him and did not. He has described a sense of betrayal, a feeling that the promises made before Iron Man became a phenomenon evaporated the moment success arrived. Whether Downey was ever in a position to influence Howard's contract is debatable. What is not debatable is the outcome. Terrence Howard did not return for Iron Man 2. Don Cheadle replaced him as James Rhodes, and in a moment that became infamous, Cheadle's first line in the sequel, looking directly at the camera, was a dry acknowledgement of the switch. The audience laughed, the industry noticed, and a pattern was established. This was not just an actor being recast. This was Marvel Studios, in its infancy, learning that it held the power in these relationships, not the talent. The franchise was the star. The characters were the draw. Individual actors, no matter how talented, were replaceable components in a machine that was bigger than any single person. That realization, that the machine matters more than the people inside it, would echo through nearly every controversy Marvel would face for the next 2 decades. It was not a lesson Marvel learned reluctantly. It was a lesson Marvel embraced. The Howard situation was a negotiation that went wrong. What happened with Edward Norton was something different. It was a collision between 2 philosophies of filmmaking, and it revealed something about Marvel Studios that would define its relationship with directors and actors for years to come. Edward Norton signed on to star in The Incredible Hulk, which was released in June of 2008, just 1 month after Iron Man. Norton was not simply hired as an actor. He was brought in as a creative partner. He contributed significantly to the screenplay, working alongside writer Zach Penn to reshape the script. Norton had a specific vision for the character and the film. He wanted something darker, more psychologically complex, more in line with the tone of the Bill Bixby television series from the late 1970s. He poured himself into the role and the writing process in a way that suggested he saw this as more than a paycheck. This was going to be his character. The problems began in post-production. Norton reportedly wanted a longer cut of the film, one that preserved more of the character-driven scenes he had fought to include. Marvel wanted a leaner, more action-oriented film that could compete with Iron Man at the box office. The 2 visions were incompatible, and Marvel, as the studio, had final cut. When the finished film was released, Norton felt that much of his contribution had been stripped away. His response was telling. He did not simply express disappointment privately. He refused to do significant press for the film. For a studio that relied on its stars to sell tickets, this was an act of open defiance. The Incredible Hulk earned $264 million worldwide. Respectable, but the lowest-grossing MCU film at that point, and a clear underperformance compared to Iron Man. When it came time to assemble the cast for the Avengers, Marvel made a decision that sent a clear message to every actor in Hollywood. They replaced Edward Norton with Mark Ruffalo. The statement Marvel released through the president of production at the time was remarkable in its directness. The studio said it needed an actor who embodied the creativity and collaborative spirit of its other talent, and that the Avengers demanded that same spirit. Read between the lines, and the message was unmistakable. Edward Norton was not a team player. Edward Norton prioritized his own vision over the collective project. Edward Norton would not be coming back. Norton responded with a statement of his own, expressing surprise and saying he had expected to be part of the ensemble. But the damage was done, and the precedent was set. Marvel Studios was not interested in auteurs who wanted to reshape projects to match their personal artistic vision. Marvel Studios was interested in collaborators who would execute the studio's vision with skill and enthusiasm. That was the deal. Take it or leave it. Sit with that for a moment. Because the tension between the studio's need for control and individual creators' desire for artistic expression is not just a footnote in Marvel's history. It is the central tension that runs through nearly every controversy in this video. Every fired director, every disgruntled actor, every creative clash can be traced back to this fundamental question: who owns the vision? And Marvel's answer, from the very beginning, was unambiguous. Marvel owns the vision. Everyone else is a guest. The Norton situation played out relatively quietly, compared to what would come later. The public was not yet invested enough in the MCU to treat casting changes as betrayals. The Incredible Hulk was widely regarded as the weakest entry in the nascent franchise, and Norton's departure was processed as Hollywood business as usual. But inside the industry, the implications were enormous. Directors and actors who were considering Marvel projects understood, perhaps for the first time, that this was not going to be a traditional studio-talent relationship. This was something new. This was a franchise factory, and the factory had its own rules. And those rules were about to collide with one of the most respected directors in genre filmmaking. There is a version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe where Edgar Wright directed Ant-Man. Imagine what that would have looked like. Edgar Wright, the filmmaker behind Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. A director whose visual style is so distinctive, so meticulously constructed, that every frame of his films feels like it could only have been made by him. Wright did not just pitch an Ant-Man movie to Marvel. He had been developing one since before the MCU existed. His involvement with the project predated Iron Man. He wrote a treatment, developed a screenplay with Joe Cornish, and spent years in a creative partnership with Marvel that suggested Ant-Man would be his entry point into the biggest franchise in film history. The development stretched across nearly a decade. Wright was announced as director as early as 2006. He screened test footage at San Diego Comic-Con in 2012 to enthusiastic reception. Everything suggested that Ant-Man would be an Edgar Wright film, made within the Marvel system, but carrying his unmistakable sensibility. Then, on May 23, 2014, just over a year before the film's scheduled release, Marvel Studios and Edgar Wright jointly announced that they had parted ways due to differences in their visions of the film. The statement was polite. The reality was not. What emerged in the weeks and months that followed was a picture of a creative relationship that had been eroding for years. Wright had written a screenplay that existed somewhat independently of the broader MCU. His Ant-Man was designed to work as a standalone story, not as a piece of a larger puzzle. As the MCU grew and its interconnected structure became more rigid, Marvel began requesting changes to Wright's script that would tie Ant-Man more directly to the events of other films. References to other characters, connections to the larger timeline, the kinds of adjustments that, from Marvel's perspective, were necessary to maintain the cohesion of their universe, and from Wright's perspective, were undermining the integrity of the film he had spent nearly a decade building. The specifics of the final break have never been fully disclosed. Wright has been characteristically gracious about the split, declining to publicly criticize Marvel and simply noting that the film that was eventually made was not his film. But people close to the production have been less restrained. The picture that emerges is one of a director who was asked to compromise his vision one too many times, who looked at the script he was being asked to shoot and no longer recognized it as his work, and who chose to walk away rather than put his name on something he did not believe in. Peyton Reed was brought in to direct, and the film that was released in July of 2015 was a commercial success, earning $519 million worldwide. Critics were generally positive. The MCU continued its march, but something was lost. The Wright departure became a symbol of everything that made Marvel both successful and creatively constraining. The machine worked, the machine produced results, but the machine had no room for a filmmaker who wanted to make his own movie within the machine's walls. Patty Jenkins learned the same lesson even earlier, though her departure received less attention at the time. Jenkins, who had directed Charlize Theron to an Academy Award in Monster, was hired to direct Thor: The Dark World in October of 2011. She had a specific vision for the sequel, one she later described as being inspired by Romeo and Juliet. Her version would have kept Thor and Jane Foster separated across realms, exploring the emotional weight of their distance. It was a character-driven approach to a franchise that Marvel was increasingly steering towards spectacle and connectivity. Jenkins departed the project in December of 2011, just 2 months after her hiring was confirmed. The official explanation was creative differences. The reality, as it emerged over the following years, was more complicated. Jenkins later said that she could not make a good movie out of the story Marvel wanted to tell. She saw the direction the studio was pushing and recognized that it would not work, and she did not want to be the person held responsible when it failed. Marvel, for its part, apparently grew concerned that Jenkins was not moving fast enough and feared the film would miss its release date. The fallout was significant in ways that extended beyond Jenkins herself. Natalie Portman, who had personally championed Jenkins for the directing job, was reported to be furious when she learned of the departure. Some accounts suggest that Portman was not even informed before the news became public. The actress, who had signed on in part because of the promise of working with a visionary female director, was now attached to a project whose creative leadership had evaporated overnight. Alan Taylor was brought in to direct, and Thor: The Dark World was released in November of 2013. It earned $644 million worldwide, but received the weakest critical reception of any MCU film to that point. Taylor himself later expressed frustration with the experience, saying that the final film did not reflect his vision either. Jenkins, meanwhile, went on to direct Wonder Woman for Warner Brothers in 2017, proving that the creative instincts Marvel had deemed insufficient were more than enough for a different studio. The irony was hard to miss. These director departures were not isolated incidents. They were expressions of a structural reality. Marvel Studios, under Kevin Feige's leadership, operated on the principle that the franchise was the author. Individual directors were hired to execute specific chapters within a larger story that had already been planned. The directors who thrived in this system were the ones who found creative freedom within constraints, who saw the Marvel formula as a structure to build within rather than a cage to escape from. The Russo brothers. Taika Waititi, at least initially. Ryan Coogler. John Watts. These directors produced distinctive work while staying inside the lines. But the directors who came to Marvel with their own fully formed visions, who wanted to make their movie rather than Marvel's movie, invariably hit a wall. And that wall was not going to move. Not for Edgar Wright, not for Patty Jenkins, not for anyone. The creative tensions between Marvel and its directors were, in many ways, a symptom of a deeper structural conflict within the company itself. And to understand that conflict, you need to understand the man who sat at the top of Marvel's organizational chart for over a decade, shaping the company's culture in ways that the public rarely saw. His name was Isaac Perlmutter, and the story of his influence on the MCU is one of the most consequential and least discussed chapters in Marvel's history. Perlmutter was born in Israel in 1942, served in the Six-Day War, and immigrated to the United States in the 1960s. He made his fortune through a series of business ventures before becoming involved with the company then known as Toy Biz, which acquired Marvel out of bankruptcy in the late 1990s. By the time the MCU was launched in 2008, Perlmutter was the CEO of Marvel Entertainment, the parent company that controlled Marvel Studios. Kevin Feige, the creative architect of the MCU, reported to him. Perlmutter was, by all accounts, obsessive about cost control. Legendary stories circulated through Hollywood about his frugality. He reportedly scrutinized budgets line by line, questioned expenditures that other executives would have approved without a second thought, and created an atmosphere where spending money felt like a personal offense to the CEO. In the early years, this frugality served Marvel well. The studio was working with smaller budgets than its competitors and needed to be disciplined about where every dollar went. Iron Man was made for roughly $140 million, a fraction of what comparable blockbusters cost at other studios. But Perlmutter's influence extended beyond budgets. He established what became known as the Marvel Creative Committee, a group that included senior Marvel executives and comic book creators who provided input on every film the studio produced. The committee's members reportedly included figures like Joe Quesada, Dan Buckley, and Alan Fine, along with writers such as Brian Michael Bendis. On paper, the committee was designed to ensure that the films stayed true to the spirit of the source material. In practice, according to multiple accounts from people who worked within the system, the committee became a bottleneck that slowed decision-making, introduced conflicting notes, and created an environment where Kevin Feige's creative instincts were constantly being second-guessed by people who had never made a film. The committee's influence showed up in specific, identifiable ways. One of the most frequently cited examples involves the development of films featuring female and non-white leads. Multiple reports have indicated that Perlmutter and the creative committee were resistant to greenlighting a Black Widow solo film, a Black Panther film, and a Captain Marvel film. The reasoning, as it has been reported, was grounded in Perlmutter's belief that female-led and minority-led superhero films did not perform well at the box office. a belief supported by the relative underperformance of previous attempts like Catwoman and Elektra, but one that ignored the obvious fact that those films failed because they were poorly made, not because of the gender or race of their protagonists. The tension between Feige and Perlmutter reached its peak during the development of Captain America: Civil War in 2015. Feige wanted to make the film he believed was right. Perlmutter and the creative committee wanted changes. The specifics of their disagreements have been reported in varying levels of detail, but the broad picture is consistent. Feige went directly to Disney CEO Bob Iger and told him that the current structure was untenable. He could not make the films he needed to make with Perlmutter and the creative committee standing between him and the final product. Iger's response was decisive. He restructured Marvel's corporate hierarchy so that Marvel Studios reported directly to the Walt Disney Studios division, effectively removing Perlmutter from the film side of the business. The creative committee was dissolved. Feige was, for the first time, the unchallenged creative leader of the MCU. Perlmutter retained control of Marvel Television and Marvel's other divisions, but the films, the crown jewels of the operation, were no longer his domain. This restructuring happened in August of 2015, and its effects were immediate and visible. Within the next few years, Marvel released Black Panther, Captain Marvel, and began development on projects that the creative committee would likely have resisted. The artistic and commercial results spoke for themselves. Black Panther earned over $1.3 billion worldwide and won 3 Academy Awards. Captain Marvel earned over $1.1 billion. The films that Perlmutter's philosophy would have prevented became some of the most successful in Marvel's history. But the Perlmutter era left scars that went deeper than organizational charts. The years of cost-cutting created a culture within Marvel's production pipeline that would come back to haunt the studio in ways we will discuss later. The years of creative interference created a reputation within Hollywood that made some directors wary of working with Marvel. And the years of resistance to diversity meant that the MCU spent its first decade telling stories almost exclusively about white men, a gap that the studio has been trying to close ever since. The diversity issue deserves specific attention because the numbers are stark. From 2008 to 2017, every single MCU film was headlined by a white male protagonist. Every one. 9 years. 17 films. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man. The Guardians ensemble was led by a white man. The Avengers ensemble was led by white men. Women appeared in supporting roles. People of color appeared in supporting roles. But the center of every story, every poster, every marketing campaign was a white man. This was not because diverse stories could not succeed commercially. It was because the people making the decisions, Perlmutter and the creative committee, did not believe they could succeed, and the evidence they cited, the failure of Catwoman in 2004, the modest performance of Elektra in 2005, was a textbook example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those films did not fail because they featured female protagonists. They failed because they were poorly conceived, poorly executed, and poorly marketed. Using their failure as proof that audiences did not want female-led superhero films was like setting a building on fire and then concluding that buildings are inherently flammable and should not be constructed. When Black Panther finally proved that diverse-led superhero films could not just succeed, but dominate, it did not just vindicate the creative instincts that Perlmutter had suppressed. It revealed the staggering opportunity cost of his resistance. How many billions of dollars had been left on the table because the people in charge could not imagine a world where a black superhero or a female superhero could carry a franchise? How many stories had gone untold because the default assumption was that only white men could be heroes? The answer is unknowable, but the question itself is damning. Perlmutter himself was eventually pushed out of Disney entirely. In March of 2023, as part of a sweeping corporate restructuring led by Bob Iger, who had returned as Disney CEO, Perlmutter was informed that his Marvel Entertainment division would be folded into other parts of the company, and that there was no longer a role for him. His departure coincided with a proxy battle in which activist investor Nelson Peltz, who was allied with Perlmutter, sought board seats at Disney, a fight that further cemented the rift between Perlmutter and the company he had helped build. The man who had built Marvel from bankruptcy into a multi-billion-dollar empire left without ceremony, without a farewell, without the kind of public acknowledgement that his contributions, however complicated, might have warranted. That is not a small thing. The person who saved Marvel from financial oblivion, who oversaw its transformation from a bankrupt comic book company into the most valuable entertainment brand in the world, was pushed out the door because his instincts, his frugality, and his resistance to change had become liabilities rather than assets. The very qualities that made Perlmutter essential in Marvel's early years made him an obstacle in its later ones. And the franchise moved on without him, the same way it moved on without Terrence Howard and Edward Norton and Edgar Wright. The machine does not stop for anyone. That dynamic, the machine's relentless forward motion, was about to be tested in a way that no one anticipated. Because the next controversy did not involve a director or an actor or a corporate executive. It involved one of the most beloved creative voices in the entire MCU, a filmmaker whose sensibility had defined one of Marvel's most popular franchises. And the controversy did not begin with a creative disagreement. It began with tweets. In July of 2018, conservative figures including commentator Mike Cernovich surfaced a collection of old social media posts made by James Gunn, the writer and director of Guardians of the Galaxy, and its sequel. The conservative outlet The Daily Caller was among the first to report on them. The tweets, which had been posted primarily between 2008 and 2012, contained jokes about pedophilia, rape, the Holocaust, AIDS, and the September 11th attacks. The content was, by any reasonable standard, deeply offensive. Gunn had not hidden these tweets. They had been publicly available for years. Some had even been the subject of minor controversy when Gunn was first hired by Marvel. But in the summer of 2018, in the midst of a politically charged cultural moment, the tweets were weaponized. The campaign to amplify Gunn's old posts was driven by figures in the conservative media ecosystem who were reportedly motivated, at least in part, by Gunn's outspoken criticism of the Trump administration. The effort was deliberate and targeted. The tweets were compiled, screenshotted, and disseminated across social media with the explicit goal of pressuring Disney to fire Gunn. And it worked. Within days of the tweets going viral, Alan Horn, the chairman of Walt Disney Studios, announced that Gunn had been fired from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Horn stated that the attitudes and statements in the tweets were indefensible and inconsistent with the studio's values. The reaction from the people who worked with Gunn was immediate and almost unanimously supportive of the director. The cast of Guardians of the Galaxy, led by Chris Pratt, Zoe Saldana, and Dave Bautista, released a joint open letter supporting Gunn and calling for his reinstatement. Bautista was particularly vocal, saying publicly that Gunn's firing was the result of a politically motivated hit job and threatening to leave the franchise if Gunn was not brought back. Other directors and writers within the Marvel ecosystem expressed support for Gunn privately and, in some cases, publicly. What made the situation so complicated was that the tweets were genuinely terrible. Nobody defended their content. Not Gunn, who had apologized for them years earlier and acknowledged that they reflected a period in his career when he cultivated a deliberately provocative persona. Not his supporters, who focused their arguments on the fact that Gunn had already addressed and repented for the tweets, that people deserved the possibility of growth, and that firing him set a dangerous precedent where anyone's past statements could be used as leverage to destroy their career for political reasons. The firing stood for approximately 9 months. During that period, Gunn was not idle. He was hired by Warner Brothers to write and direct The Suicide Squad for DC, a move that represented one of the most significant talent transfers in the history of the superhero film rivalry. The director who had defined the tone and heart of one of Marvel's most beloved franchises was now working for the competition, and the circumstances of his departure made it difficult for anyone to blame him for going. The Suicide Squad was released in August of 2021 and was widely praised as one of the best DC films in years. a validation of Gunn's talent that made his firing look even more short-sighted. Then, in March of 2019, Disney quietly rehired Gunn to write and direct Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. The reversal was remarkable. Disney is not a company that admits mistakes easily, and reinstating a director who had been fired over offensive content was an acknowledgement, implicit but unmistakable, that the original decision had been wrong. Gunn went on to complete the Guardians trilogy. Volume 3 was released in May of 2023, earned $845 million worldwide, and was widely regarded as one of the best entries in the entire MCU. Gunn then departed Marvel entirely to become the co-head of DC Studios, taking his talents to the competition permanently. The Gunn controversy revealed something important about the relationship between studios and the cultural forces that surround them. Disney fired Gunn not because anyone at the company genuinely believed he was a danger, but because the optics of keeping him were, in that moment, worse than the optics of letting him go. The decision was reactive, driven by fear of public backlash rather than by a considered assessment of the situation. And when the backlash reversed direction, when the public outcry shifted from anger at Gunn to anger at Disney for caving to a political campaign, the company reversed course. That is not the behavior of an organization acting on principle. That is the behavior of an organization that understands its own decision-making, is driven by public perception, and is willing to change direction when the wind shifts. It is pragmatic, it is understandable, and it is, in its own quiet way, deeply unsettling, because it means that the fate of any creative person working within the Disney ecosystem is ultimately determined not by the quality of their work or the sincerity of their character, but by whatever narrative the public decides to embrace on any given day. While Gunn's story had a relatively happy ending, the next controversy did not end well for anyone, and it began not with tweets or creative differences, but with a single film and a decision about how it would be released. Black Widow was released on July 9, 2021. It was the first MCU film to arrive after a pandemic-induced drought that had left theaters shuttered for over a year. Fans were hungry for new Marvel content. The film itself was a long-overdue solo outing for Scarlett Johansson's Natasha Romanoff, a character who had been part of the MCU since Iron Man 2 in 2010, but had never headlined her own film. The movie earned $80 million in its opening weekend in domestic theaters. It also earned $60 million on Disney Plus through Premier Access, a $30 rental option that allowed subscribers to watch the film at home on the same day it hit cinemas. And that is where the trouble began. Scarlett Johansson filed a lawsuit against the Walt Disney Company on July 29, 2021, just 3 weeks after Black Widow's release. The lawsuit alleged that Disney had breached her contract by releasing the film simultaneously on Disney Plus, thereby diverting audiences away from theaters and reducing the box office revenue on which a significant portion of Johansson's compensation was based. The complaint stated that Johansson's representatives had negotiated a guarantee that Black Widow would receive an exclusive theatrical release, and that Disney had ignored that guarantee in order to boost subscriber numbers for its fledgling streaming service. The lawsuit was explosive not just because of its financial implications, but because of what it represented. Johansson was not a disgruntled supporting player. She was one of the highest-profile actresses in the world, a founding member of the Avengers, and one of the faces most closely associated with the MCU's decade-long dominance. For her to publicly sue Disney was an act of extraordinary professional courage, or perhaps desperation. Either way, it signaled that something fundamental had broken in the relationship between talent and studio. Disney's initial response made things worse. The company released a statement saying the lawsuit had no merit and, in a move that was widely criticized across Hollywood, disclosed Johansson's compensation from the film, stating that she had already received $20 million and that the simultaneous release had significantly enhanced her ability to earn additional compensation. The statement carried an unmistakable implication. Johansson was being greedy. She had already been paid handsomely, and her lawsuit was an act of ingratitude during a global pandemic, when people were dying and Disney was trying to provide entertainment to audiences who could not safely go to theaters. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Hollywood rallied around Johansson. Other talent agencies and management companies publicly expressed their support. Elizabeth Olsen, one of Johansson's MCU co-stars, said she understood the lawsuit completely. Jamie Lee Curtis spoke out on Johansson's behalf. The perception within the industry was that Disney had tried to publicly shame an actress for asserting her contractual rights, and the attempt had revealed something ugly about the studio's priorities. Subscriber growth for a streaming service mattered more than honoring commitments to the people who made the content that drove those subscribers in the first place. The lawsuit was settled in September of 2021 for an undisclosed amount. Sources reported the settlement was substantial, with some estimates placing it near the $50 million Johansson had initially sought. In a carefully worded joint statement, both sides expressed satisfaction with the resolution and indicated that they looked forward to working together in the future. Whether that future collaboration will actually materialize remains to be seen, but the public reconciliation served its purpose. The bleeding stopped, but the damage extended far beyond Johansson. The Black Widow lawsuit forced every major talent agency in Hollywood to re-examine the contracts their clients had signed with Disney and other studios that were increasingly prioritizing streaming releases. The traditional model, where star compensation was tied to theatrical box office performance, had been exposed as vulnerable to a unilateral decision by the studio to change the distribution strategy. If Disney could release a film on its streaming platform and reduce an actor's theatrical earnings without consequence, then no contract was safe. The lawsuit also arrived at a moment when the relationship between Hollywood talent and the streaming platforms was already under enormous strain. The economics of entertainment were being rewritten in real time, and the people who made the entertainment had no seat at the table where the new rules were being drafted. The traditional metrics that had governed compensation for decades, theatrical box office performance, home video sales, television syndication revenue, were being replaced by metrics that the studios controlled and, crucially, refused to share. Streaming viewership data was proprietary. The algorithms that determined what content got promoted and what content got buried were opaque. The financial models that studios used to justify compensation for streaming releases were, from the perspective of talent representatives, black boxes designed to minimize payouts. Within 2 years of Johansson's lawsuit, those tensions would erupt into the 2023 writers' and actors' strikes, the longest work stoppages in decades. The writers struck first, beginning on May 2, 2023, and the actors followed on July 14. Both strikes centered on streaming compensation and, increasingly, on the use of artificial intelligence to replicate or replace human creative labor. The strikes lasted until September and November of 2023, respectively, shutting down production across Hollywood for months. Marvel projects were directly affected. Deadpool and Wolverine's production was paused. Other projects were delayed. Johansson's lawsuit did not cause those strikes, but it was an early, high-profile expression of the same underlying conflict. The economics of entertainment were changing, and the people who made the entertainment were being asked to absorb the costs of that change while the corporations reaped the benefits. The Black Widow lawsuit was a single actress fighting for her contractual rights. The strikes were an entire industry fighting for its future. The through line between them was the same question: who benefits from the work? And the answer, increasingly, was not the people doing the work. Consider what that means for the MCU specifically. The franchise that had been built on the promise of mutual enrichment, where the studio and the talent rose together, where a role in an Avengers film could transform an actor's career and earning potential overnight, was now a franchise where the studio's interests and the talent's interests were diverging. The machine was no longer lifting everyone. The machine was protecting itself. There is a moment in Iron Man 3 that changed how audiences understood the MCU's relationship with its own source material. It happens roughly halfway through the film. Tony Stark has tracked the Mandarin, the terrorist who has been threatening the world with a series of devastating attacks, to his compound. Stark breaks in, expecting to confront a fearsome mastermind. Instead, he finds Trevor Slattery. Trevor Slattery is a washed-up British actor, played by Ben Kingsley, with a slack-jawed cheerfulness that borders on the surreal. He is drunk. He is confused. He has no idea what the Mandarin actually is. He was hired by the real villain, Aldrich Killian, played by Guy Pearce, to portray a fictional terrorist on camera, reading scripts and performing in propaganda videos designed to create a phantom menace that would distract from Killian's actual operations. The Mandarin, the iconic Iron Man villain from the comics, one of the most recognizable antagonists in Marvel's publishing history, was a hoax, a performance within a performance, a joke. Iron Man 3 was released on May 3, 2013. It was directed by Shane Black, who brought his signature blend of noir plotting and subversive humor to the project. The film earned $1.215 billion worldwide, making it the fifth highest-grossing film of all time at that point. By any commercial metric, it was a triumph. But among a significant portion of the fan base, the Mandarin twist was received as a betrayal. The backlash was immediate and intense. Comic book fans who had waited years to see the Mandarin brought to life on screen felt cheated. They had been promised an iconic villain and given a punchline. The marketing campaign had leaned heavily on Ben Kingsley's portrayal of the Mandarin as a terrifying, charismatic figure, which made the reveal feel not just disappointing but dishonest. The trailers had sold one movie. The film delivered another. Shane Black defended the twist, arguing that the original Mandarin character from the comics was rooted in racist stereotypes of Asian villainy, the Fu Manchu archetype, and that a faithful adaptation would have been offensive. The twist, in his view, was a way to engage with the character's legacy while subverting its problematic elements. There was intellectual substance to this argument. The original Mandarin was, in fact, deeply problematic, but the counter-argument from fans was equally valid. You do not solve the problem of a racist character by erasing the character entirely. You solve it by reimagining the character in a way that preserves what made them compelling while removing what made them offensive. The twist, from this perspective, was a dodge, not a solution. Marvel itself seemed to acknowledge that the backlash had been more severe than anticipated. In 2014, the studio released a short film titled All Hail the King, which revealed that a real Mandarin existed in the MCU and was not pleased that his identity had been appropriated by Slattery's performance. The short film was a direct response to fan anger, an attempt to walk back the twist without undoing it entirely. Years later, in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, released in September of 2021, the real Mandarin was introduced in the form of Xu Wenwu, played by Tony Leung. The character was reimagined as a complex, morally ambiguous figure with a 1,000-year history, free of the racist trappings of the original. It was, arguably, the solution that fans had wanted all along, but it took Marvel 8 years and 2 additional projects to get there. The Mandarin twist controversy matters beyond the specifics of Iron Man 3 because it established a dynamic that would repeat itself throughout the MCU's history. Marvel makes a creative decision. A portion of the fan base reacts with fury. Marvel either doubles down or, more commonly, finds a way to retroactively address the complaint in a subsequent project. The franchise's serialized nature gives it a unique ability to correct course, to treat each film not as a final statement, but as a chapter that can be revised by later chapters. This flexibility is a tremendous strength, but it also creates an environment where the studio is perpetually reacting to its audience, where creative decisions are made and then unmade based on the volume of the response. That is not how good art is typically made. But the MCU has never claimed to be just art. It is also a product, and products respond to consumer feedback. The Mandarin twist also exposed a tension that runs through the MCU's entire approach to adaptation. Marvel's source material is vast, contradictory, and accumulated over decades of publishing. Characters have been reinvented, retconned, and reimagined countless times in the comics. The MCU has always been selective about which elements it adapts and how faithfully it adapts them. But fans, particularly longtime comics readers, have strong attachments to specific versions of these characters, and when the MCU deviates from those versions in ways that feel arbitrary or disrespectful, the reaction can be fierce. This was not the only time Marvel would face accusations of mishandling characters with deep roots in the comics. And the next instance would involve not a villain, but two heroes whose comic book identities were inextricable from their heritage, their history, and the trauma that defined them. Wanda and Pietro Maximoff first appeared in the MCU in a mid-credits scene in Captain America: The Winter Soldier in April of 2014, and then in full in Avengers: Age of Ultron in May of 2015. In the comics, their identities are layered and specific. They are the children of Magneto, a Holocaust survivor. They are Jewish and Romani. Their heritage is not incidental to who they are. It is the foundation of their story. The trauma of the Holocaust, the persecution of the Romani people, the complex legacy of a father who survived genocide and became a militant revolutionary. All of these elements feed directly into who Wanda and Pietro are as characters and what their powers mean. The MCU could not use any of this. The film rights to mutants and to Magneto belonged to Fox at the time, which meant that Marvel Studios could not reference mutants, could not include Magneto, and could not explicitly identify the Maximoffs as his children. This was a legal limitation, not a creative choice. But the alternative that Marvel constructed was deeply troubling to many fans and critics. In the MCU, Wanda and Pietro are from the fictional Eastern European nation of Sokovia. They are not explicitly identified as Jewish or Romani. Their parents were killed by a Stark Industries missile, and their hatred of Tony Stark drove them to volunteer for experiments conducted by Hydra, the organization that, in the MCU as in the comics, is a direct descendant of the Nazi regime. Baron von Strucker, the Hydra operative who oversaw their experimentation, used Loki's scepter, which contained the Mind Stone, to give them their powers. Read that again, stripped of any narrative framing. Two characters who, in the source material, are Jewish and Romani, the peoples most targeted by the Nazis, were reimagined as voluntary participants in experiments conducted by a Nazi organization. They were not coerced. They were not kidnapped. They volunteered. They walked into a Hydra facility and offered themselves up to a group that, in any real-world parallel, would have been dedicated to their extermination. The MCU does provide a motivation for this choice. Wanda and Pietro hate Tony Stark because his weapons killed their parents. Their rage is directed at the American arms dealer, not at Hydra's ideology. They do not understand, or perhaps do not care, what Hydra truly represents, and they defect from Hydra's service as soon as they understand Ultron's plan to destroy humanity. The narrative does not frame them as Nazis. It frames them as desperate, traumatized young people who made a terrible choice out of grief. But the criticism is not about what the MCU intended. It is about what the MCU erased. By removing the Jewish and Romani identity of these characters, and then placing them in a storyline that has them voluntarily joining a Nazi organization, the MCU created a narrative that, at minimum, is profoundly tone-deaf about the historical realities of the peoples whose identity it stripped away. The character's heritage was not just omitted. It was replaced with a story that inverts the actual historical relationship between those peoples and the organization they are now shown serving. This was not a controversy that erupted in a single moment. It built slowly, discussed in academic articles, fan essays, and cultural criticism over the course of several years. WandaVision, the Disney Plus series released in January of 2021, provided an opportunity to address or at least acknowledge the Maximoffs' heritage, but the show focused on Wanda's grief over Vision's death rather than her ethnic or cultural identity. The erasure continued, not through malice, but through indifference. And indifference, when it comes to the histories of persecuted peoples, is its own form of harm. The Maximoff controversy sits alongside the Ancient One, casting as part of a broader pattern of Marvel's complicated relationship with representation and cultural sensitivity. And the Ancient One situation deserves its own examination, because it reveals how a decision made with the best of intentions can still produce a deeply problematic outcome. Doctor Strange was released on November 4, 2016, and it featured Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One, the sorcerer who mentors Stephen Strange in the mystic arts. In the comics, the Ancient One is a Tibetan man. In the film, the character was reimagined as a Celtic woman. The casting was immediately criticized as whitewashing, the practice of casting white actors in roles originally written for people of color. Marvel and director Scott Derrickson offered several explanations for the casting decision. They argued that the original character was rooted in Orientalist stereotypes, the wise old Asian man on a mountaintop, and that casting an Asian actor in the role would have perpetuated those stereotypes. They also acknowledged, more quietly, that making the character Tibetan could have complicated the film's release in China, a market that was becoming increasingly important to Hollywood's bottom line. The implication was that depicting Tibet positively could anger the Chinese government and jeopardize the film's access to the world's second-largest movie market. The defense that the original character was stereotypical had some validity. The Ancient One, as drawn in the 1960s comics, was absolutely a product of Orientalist tropes. But the solution, replacing an Asian character with a white one, was criticized as solving a representation problem by eliminating representation entirely. You do not fix a stereotype by removing the person of color from the story. You fix it by writing a better version of that character, one that transcends the stereotype while honoring the cultural origins. The Asian media advocacy group Mana publicly condemned the casting, arguing that an Asian actor in the role of a revered mentor figure would have been a significant boost for Asian representation in mainstream blockbusters, and that the opportunity had been squandered. The criticism was amplified when a series of emails between Swinton and filmmaker Margaret Cho were leaked, in which Cho expressed frustration with the casting, and Swinton seemed genuinely confused about why the decision was controversial. Years later, in May of 2021, Kevin Feige publicly stated that the casting of Swinton was a mistake. He said that the team at Marvel had thought they were being smart and cutting edge by avoiding the cliché, but that it was a wake-up call. The admission was notable because Feige rarely acknowledges errors, and his willingness to call the decision a mistake suggested that the criticism had genuinely affected how Marvel approached casting decisions going forward. Whether that acknowledgement translated into meaningful change is a more complicated question, but the public admission itself was significant. The whitewashing controversy around Doctor Strange and the erasure of the Maximoff's heritage are connected by a common thread. In both cases, Marvel made decisions that prioritized narrative convenience or commercial pragmatism over cultural authenticity. In both cases, the people whose identities were erased or overwritten were members of historically marginalized communities. And in both cases, the defense offered by the studio, that they were trying to avoid stereotypes, that they were constrained by legal or commercial realities, contained enough truth to make the decision understandable while still failing to justify the outcome. This is what makes representation controversies so difficult to discuss. The people making the decisions are rarely acting out of malice. They are navigating genuine constraints. They are trying to serve multiple audiences. They are making compromises in real time with imperfect information. But the cumulative effect of those compromises is a pattern, and the pattern has consequences. When the MCU spent its first decade centering white male characters and sidelining or erasing the identities of characters from marginalized communities, it told a story about who matters and who does not, regardless of the intentions behind any individual decision. There is a specific kind of failure that comes not from a lack of ambition, but from a catastrophic mismatch between ambition and execution. Marvel's Inhumans is the purest expression of that failure in the entire history of the franchise, and the story of how it happened reveals something important about the institutional pressures that can turn a promising concept into a disaster. The Inhumans were, for a period in the mid-2010s, positioned as one of Marvel's most important properties. This was not because the characters were particularly popular with mainstream audiences. Most people outside of dedicated comics readers had never heard of Black Bolt, Medusa, Karnak, or Crystal. The Inhumans' elevation was strategic. Because the film rights to the X-Men and their associated concept of mutants belonged to Fox, Marvel could not use mutants in its films or, increasingly, in its comics marketing. The Inhumans, whose powers came from exposure to a substance called Terrigen Mist, rather than from a genetic mutation, were positioned as a substitute. They could serve the same narrative function as mutants, a marginalized group of superpowered beings dealing with prejudice and identity, without triggering any legal complications. An Inhumans feature film was announced as part of Marvel's Phase 3 slate in 2014, scheduled for release in November of 2018. It was going to be a theatrical event, directed with the full resources of Marvel Studios' film division. Then it was quietly removed from the schedule. The reasons for the demotion were never officially explained, but the timing coincided with the restructuring that separated Marvel Studios from Ike Perlmutter's Marvel Entertainment. The Inhumans had been Perlmutter's project. With Feige now operating independently, the Inhumans were no longer a priority for the film division. But the project did not die. It was simply transferred from the film side to the television side, which was still under Perlmutter's control. Marvel Television, headed by Jeff Loeb, partnered with IMAX Corporation and ABC to produce an Inhumans television series. The first 2 episodes would premiere in IMAX theaters in September of 2017, before the series moved to its regular slot on ABC. It was an unprecedented experiment in cross-platform distribution. It was also a disaster from the moment the first trailer dropped. The trailer revealed production values that were immediately and universally mocked. The costumes looked cheap. The visual effects were substandard. The wig used for Medusa, the Inhuman Queen whose living hair is one of the character's defining features, was so unconvincing that it became a meme. The vast majority of social media reactions to Medusa's appearance were negative. The showrunner was Scott Buck, who had previously run Marvel's Iron Fist for Netflix, the most poorly received entry in the Netflix-Marvel partnership. Confidence was not high. The series premiered in IMAX on September 1, 2017, and the results were exactly as bad as the trailer had suggested. The first 2 episodes, projected on enormous IMAX screens, looked worse at that scale, not better. The television-grade visual effects and production design that might have been passable on a home screen became glaringly inadequate when blown up to IMAX dimensions. The IMAX screenings grossed only $3.5 million worldwide, against what was by all accounts a significantly larger investment from IMAX. It was a financial catastrophe for the theater chain. When the series moved to ABC on September 29, 2017, the ratings were poor and declined steadily. The final episode drew only 1.95 million viewers. The critical reception was devastating. On Rotten Tomatoes, the series holds an 11% approval rating from critics, with the consensus describing it as setting a new low standard for the MCU. It was canceled after a single season. The planned multi-season arc that Marvel Television had envisioned would never materialize. The Inhumans debacle matters for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that the Marvel brand was not invincible. For years, the assumption had been that the Marvel logo on a project was a guarantee of quality, or at least competence. Inhumans destroyed that assumption. The brand could not save a project that was under-budgeted, poorly conceived, and executed without the resources or creative vision necessary to meet audience expectations. Second, it exposed the deepening divide between Marvel Studios, the film division, and Marvel Television, the television division. Marvel Studios, under Feige, was producing films with budgets of $150 to $300 million, hiring top-tier directors, and maintaining rigorous quality control. Marvel Television, under Jeff Loeb and still connected to Perlmutter's cost-conscious philosophy, was producing content on dramatically smaller budgets with less oversight and, in the case of Inhumans, considerably less talent. The divide between the two divisions was one of the most poorly understood aspects of the MCU for years. The Netflix shows, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, The Punisher, and The Defenders, were produced by Marvel Television, not Marvel Studios. The ABC shows, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter, were similarly under Loeb's purview. These shows existed in a strange liminal space. They referenced the events of the films, acknowledging alien invasions and superhero battles that had occurred in the MCU, but the films never acknowledged the shows. Characters from the television side never appeared in the films. Events from the shows had no impact on the movie timeline. The connectivity was strictly one-directional, from the films down to the television shows, never the reverse. This created its own quiet controversy among fans who invested in the television characters. If you spent 5 seasons watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. deal with the fallout of Hydra's infiltration, it was jarring to realize that none of it mattered to the film side. Phil Coulson, the character whose death in the Avengers had been a pivotal moment in the MCU's first act, was resurrected in the television series and went on years of additional adventures. None of the film characters ever learned he was alive. The promise of a connected universe was, in the television space, largely an illusion. The reasons for this disconnection were rooted in the Feige-Perlmutter conflict. Feige reportedly had little involvement with Marvel Television's output and no desire to coordinate with projects he did not control. The television side made references to the films because it helped market the shows. The film side ignored the shows because Feige did not consider them part of his creative vision. 2 divisions of the same company, using the same logo, telling stories about the same universe, were operating as though the other did not exist. The Inhumans was the most extreme expression of this disconnect. The 2 divisions shared a brand but operated under fundamentally different standards. The audience could not tell the difference between Marvel Studios and Marvel Television. They just saw the Marvel logo and expected a certain level of quality. When Inhumans failed to deliver, the entire brand took the hit. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Inhumans' failure helped accelerate the consolidation of Marvel's creative output under Kevin Feige's control. In October of 2019, Feige was named Chief Creative Officer of all Marvel content, including television, publishing, and animation. Jeff Loeb departed the company. Marvel Television was folded into Marvel Studios. The era of 2 Marvel content engines operating with different standards and different leadership was over. The machine had consolidated. And that consolidated machine was about to face a controversy that had nothing to do with creative decisions or corporate politics. It had to do with the people whose labor made the machine run, the people who spent 12, 15, 18 hours a day in front of computer screens, turning actors in gray jumpsuits on green screen stages into gods and monsters and cosmic beings. The visual effects artists. And their story is one of the most damning chapters in Marvel's entire history. The Marvel Cinematic Universe runs on visual effects. This is not an exaggeration or a criticism, it is a structural fact. The vast majority of what appears on screen in an MCU film, the environments, the costumes, the powers, the creatures, the space battles, the cityscapes, the otherworldly realms, is created or substantially enhanced by visual effects artists working at dozens of studios around the world. Without visual effects, the MCU does not exist. There are no Avengers without the artists who make the Hulk look real, who make Iron Man's armor move, who make Doctor Strange's mirror dimension twist and fold. And those artists, by their own accounts, have been systematically overworked, underpaid, and treated as disposable by Marvel Studios. The issue came to widespread public attention in July of 2022 when a Reddit thread titled "Marvel Remorse" went viral. Visual effects artists, both current and former, shared their experiences working on Marvel projects, and the picture that emerged was bleak. Artists described working 7 days a week for months at a time. They described averaging 60 to 70 hours per week. They described colleagues breaking down in tears from exhaustion and stress. They described a culture where the demands were relentless, the deadlines were constantly shifting, and the compensation was inadequate for the hours required. Dhruv Govil, who worked on Guardians of the Galaxy and Spider-Man: Homecoming, stated publicly that working on Marvel projects pushed him to leave the visual effects industry entirely. He described watching colleagues reach their breaking points and concluded that the personal cost of the work was simply too high. James Dornoff, who worked on projects including Captain America, The Winter Soldier, and Eternals, revealed that he turned down a position on Avengers: Endgame because the compensation, $850 per week, would not have even met minimum wage given the 12 to 18-hour days the job required. Let that settle for a moment. Avengers: Endgame, the highest-grossing film of 2019, the culmination of 11 years of interconnected storytelling, the cultural event of the decade, was offering visual effects artists compensation that did not meet minimum wage. The specific dynamics of the Marvel and visual effects relationship made the problem worse than at other studios. Multiple artists described a process in which notes from Marvel were not just frequent but contradictory, and sometimes arrived at the last possible moment. A shot that had been approved by one supervisor would be rejected by another. Sequences that had been locked would be reopened. Entire approaches that had been developed over weeks would be scrapped and replaced with new directives that required the artist to start over with no additional time or compensation. One artist described the experience as being trapped in a feedback loop where the goalposts were always moving, but the deadline never was. The culture extended beyond individual projects. Visual effects houses that wanted to maintain their relationship with Marvel could not push back too forcefully on unreasonable demands, because there were always other studios willing to take the work. The competitive dynamics of the visual effects industry, where too many studios are chasing too few major clients, gave Marvel enormous leverage. If one studio refused to accept the terms, another would take the contract. The artists at the studio that refused would lose their jobs. The incentive structure made it nearly impossible for any individual studio to demand better conditions. The visual effects branch of IATSE, the entertainment industry union, claimed that Marvel routinely employed one artist to do work that other studios would distribute among three. This was not a secret within the industry. Marvel's reputation among visual effects houses was well known long before it became public. Studios competed fiercely for Marvel contracts because of the prestige associated with working on the biggest franchise in film, but internally, those contracts were regarded as punishing. The volume of work was enormous. The notes from Marvel were constant and often contradictory, with shots being revised dozens of times across multiple rounds of feedback. And the budgets, despite the films earning billions, were tight. Reports indicated that Marvel paid visual effects studios approximately 20% less than other major studios for comparable work. The discount was possible because studios were willing to accept lower margins in exchange for the cachet of having Marvel on their client list. But the cost of that discount was passed directly to the artists, who worked longer hours for less money on projects that demanded more from them than almost anything else in the industry. The public exposure of these working conditions created a genuine crisis for Marvel's reputation. For a brand that had built its public image on fun, on spectacle, on the joy of seeing superheroes come to life on screen, the revelation that the people making that spectacle possible were being ground down by the process was deeply uncomfortable. It also connected directly to a criticism that had been growing louder with each new MCU release. The visual effects in Marvel films and Disney Plus series were getting worse. Shots that looked unfinished were appearing in final releases. Characters rendered in computer graphics that should have been seamless were crossing the uncanny valley in the wrong direction. The quality issues that visual effects artists had been warning about privately were becoming visible to audiences. The connection was obvious and damning. When you overwork artists, underpay them, give them shifting deadlines and contradictory notes, and expect them to deliver shots of the same quality they might produce under humane conditions, the quality declines. The artists were not failing, the system was failing them, and the audience was seeing the results. Marvel has not publicly addressed these criticisms in any comprehensive way. Kevin Feige acknowledged in 2022 that the studio's production volume had been too high and that there would be a deliberate reduction in output going forward. Whether this represented a genuine commitment to improving working conditions or simply a response to declining box office returns is impossible to say from the outside. But the visual effects controversy did contribute to a broader movement within the industry. In October of 2023, visual effects workers at Marvel Studios voted to unionize, joining IATSE. It was a small but significant step toward the kind of structural change that the artists had been calling for. The visual effects controversy is not a story about bad people making evil decisions. It is a story about a system that prioritizes output over the well-being of the people who produce that output. It is a story about a machine, that word again, that consumes human labor at an unsustainable rate because the schedule demands it, the shareholders expect it, and the audience keeps buying tickets. The artists who make the MCU possible are, in the machine's calculus, a resource to be optimized, not a community to be protected. And that calculus, more than any individual controversy, reveals the moral limitations of the enterprise. The system that overworked its visual effects artists was the same system that was, by the early 2020s, beginning to overwhelm its audience. And the story of how that happened, how the most dominant entertainment franchise in history began to show cracks in its own foundation, is the story of what happens when a machine built for quality starts optimizing for quantity instead. Between the premiere of WandaVision on January 15, 2021, and the release of The Marvels on November 10, 2023, Marvel Studios produced and released an astonishing volume of content. Films and Disney Plus series arrived at a pace that would have been unthinkable during the Infinity Saga. In Phase 4 alone, which ran from 2021 to 2022, Marvel released 17 projects, including 7 theatrical films and 10 Disney Plus series and specials. That is nearly one new piece of MCU content per month for 2 years straight. During the Infinity Saga, which spanned from 2008 to 2019, Marvel released 23 films over 11 years, an average of roughly 2 per year. The pace was deliberate. Each film had time to breathe, to be marketed, to be absorbed by the audience before the next one arrived. The interconnected narrative built slowly, and the slow build was a feature, not a bug. It gave audiences time to develop attachment to characters, to catch references, to speculate about where the story was heading. The anticipation between films was part of the experience. Phase 4 abandoned that rhythm. The calculus behind the acceleration was transparent. Disney Plus needed content to justify its subscription price, and Marvel was the most reliable content engine in the Disney portfolio. So the engine was pushed harder. More series, more films, more specials, more content, faster, across more platforms. The quality paid the price. Thor: Love and Thunder, released in July of 2022, was directed by Taika Waititi, whose previous MCU entry, Thor: Ragnarok, had been one of the most beloved films in the franchise. But Love and Thunder felt rushed, tonally inconsistent, and overstuffed with comedic beats that undercut the film's more serious themes. It earned a 64% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 77% audience score, respectable numbers in isolation, but a sharp decline from Ragnarok's 93% and 92%. Eternals, released in November of 2021, was directed by Chloe Zhao, fresh off her Academy Award for Nomadland. The film attempted something genuinely ambitious, a cosmic epic spanning thousands of years of human history, told through the eyes of immortal beings. But it collapsed under its own weight, trying to introduce 10 new characters while telling a story that spanned millennia, all within the constraints of a single film. It earned a 47% critic score, the lowest in MCU history at that point. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, released in February of 2023, was particularly concerning because it was intended to launch the next major saga of the MCU. It introduced Jonathan Majors as Kang the Conqueror, the villain who was supposed to be the Thanos of the next decade of storytelling. The film earned a 46% critic score and was widely criticized for its over-reliance on computer-generated environments that looked unconvincing and a narrative that felt disconnected from the characters audiences had come to love. On the Disney Plus side, the situation was equally uneven. Shows like WandaVision and Loki received genuine critical acclaim and felt like meaningful expansions of the MCU's storytelling vocabulary. But others, like Secret Invasion and The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, were criticized for feeling like elongated films chopped into episodic pieces rather than shows designed to take advantage of the serialized format. The pacing was often uneven, with 6-episode seasons that felt both too short to fully develop their ideas and too long to sustain their narratives without padding. The cumulative effect was a phenomenon that entertainment journalists and audiences began calling superhero fatigue, or, more specifically, Marvel fatigue. Data from Parrot Analytics showed that worldwide average audience demand for MCU content declined by 20% in Phase 4 compared to Phase 3, and fell another 8% in Phase 5. Box office returns told a similar story. The Marvels, released in November of 2023, earned just $206 million worldwide, the lowest-grossing MCU film since The Incredible Hulk in 2008. The decline was not solely attributable to the volume of content. The pandemic disrupted viewing habits. Ticket prices increased. Competition from other entertainment options intensified. But the volume was a factor, and the interconnectivity that had once been the MCU's greatest selling point had become a barrier to entry. Consider what it meant to be a casual MCU fan in 2022. You enjoyed the movies. You saw them in theaters when they came out. You had not signed up for a homework assignment. But now, to understand why Wanda Maximoff had become a villain in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, you needed to have watched all 9 episodes of WandaVision. To understand the multiverse mechanics in Spider-Man: No Way Home, it helped to have watched Loki. To understand who Kang was in Quantumania, you needed Loki again. The Disney Plus series were not optional supplements to the film experience. They were, in many cases, prerequisites. And the quality of those prerequisites was inconsistent enough that watching them felt like a chore rather than a pleasure. The interconnectivity problem went deeper than homework. During the Infinity Saga, the connections between films were carefully managed. You could enjoy each film as a standalone experience while appreciating the connections if you had seen the other entries. The end credit scenes were treats, not requirements. The character crossovers were surprises, not dependencies. But in Phase 4, the connections became load-bearing in ways that punished casual viewers. If you did not understand the significance of the multiverse, large portions of the new storylines were incomprehensible. If you had not tracked the relationships established in the Disney Plus series, character dynamics in the films felt unearned. This was the paradox of Phase 4. More content was supposed to deepen the MCU's appeal. Instead, it made the MCU less accessible. The very abundance that was supposed to be the franchise's strength became its weakness. There was too much to watch, too much to remember, and not enough of it was worth the investment. When audiences feel that they need to have seen multiple Disney Plus series to understand what is happening in a theatrical film, and when those series vary dramatically in quality, the overall investment required to be an MCU fan starts to feel less like entertainment and more like obligation. The joy of anticipation, of counting down the months until the next Marvel film, was replaced by the fatigue of perpetual content consumption. Kevin Feige acknowledged the problem publicly, if indirectly, in several interviews during 2023 and 2024. He spoke about the need to reduce the studio's output, to give projects more time in development, and to ensure that each release had a clear reason for existing within the larger narrative. The planned slate for the Multiverse Saga was quietly reorganized, with some projects delayed and others reconceived. Whether these adjustments would be sufficient to reverse the trend of declining engagement remained an open question, but the acknowledgement itself was significant. Marvel had spent years acting as though its audience's appetite was bottomless. The data said otherwise. But Marvel's problems with Phase 4 were not limited to volume and quality. They also included a controversy that struck at the intersection of art, technology, and labor, and that resonated far beyond the boundaries of the MCU. Secret Invasion premiered on Disney Plus on June 21, 2023. The series, starring Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, was a spy thriller about Skrulls, the shape-shifting aliens who had been infiltrating Earth for years. The show received mixed to poor reviews and is widely regarded as one of the weakest entries in the MCU's Disney Plus lineup. But it is not the show's narrative failings that generated the most heated controversy. It is the opening title sequence. The opening credits of Secret Invasion were created using artificial intelligence. Director Ali Salim confirmed to Polygon that the animated sequence, which featured morphing, shape-shifting imagery meant to evoke the Skrulls' abilities, was generated through AI tools. Salim framed the decision as thematically appropriate, arguing that AI's ability to create images that shift and transform aligned with the show's themes of identity and deception. The reaction from the artistic community was immediate and furious. Jeff Simpson, a visual development concept artist who had worked on Secret Invasion itself, publicly stated that he was devastated by the decision and that he believed AI-generated art was unethical, dangerous, and designed solely to eliminate artists' careers. Other artists and industry organizations echoed the sentiment, pointing out that a studio that was already under fire for overworking and underpaying its visual effects artists had now taken the additional step of replacing human artists with AI for a visible, prominent part of its production. The timing was brutal. The Secret Invasion credits aired in June of 2023, just weeks before the SAG-AFTRA actors' strike began on July 14th of that year. One of the central issues in the strike was the use of AI to replicate actors' likenesses and performances. The writers' strike, which had been ongoing since May of 2023, similarly centered AI as a threat to creative labor. For Marvel, a Disney property, to use AI art in the opening credits of a major series while its parent company was negotiating with unions over AI protections was, at minimum, an extraordinary failure of awareness. At maximum, it was a deliberate signal about the direction the company intended to go. Marvel never issued a formal response to the backlash. The credits continued to air throughout the series' run. No apology was offered. No commitment to avoid AI-generated art in future projects was made. The controversy faded as the show itself faded from the cultural conversation, which happened quickly given its poor reception. But the incident left a mark on Marvel's reputation among the creative professionals whose labor sustains the franchise. It was one more data point in a pattern that suggested the studio's relationship with the artists who build its worlds was, at best, transactional and, at worst, exploitative. The Secret Invasion AI controversy, the visual effects working conditions crisis, and the Johansson lawsuit form a triangle that points to the same conclusion. The MCU's economic model depends on creative labor. The MCU's corporate behavior consistently undervalues that labor. The gap between the franchise's public celebration of creativity and its private treatment of creators is the most uncomfortable truth about the biggest entertainment brand in the world. And speaking of uncomfortable truths, there are moments when the controversies surrounding Marvel have not been about corporate behavior at all, but about the behavior of the individuals who represent the brand in the public eye. These moments are harder to navigate because they involve personal conduct rather than institutional decisions, and because the line between a person's public role and their private actions is always contested terrain. In April of 2015, during a press tour for Avengers: Age of Ultron, Chris Evans and Jeremy Renner sat for a joint interview with Digital Spy. The interviewer asked about Black Widow's romantic involvement in the film, specifically about fan expectations that Natasha Romanoff would end up romantically paired with either Captain America or Hawkeye. Evans and Renner responded with what they apparently considered playful humor. Renner called the character a slut. Evans called her a complete whore. They both laughed. The comments landed like a detonation. The backlash was instantaneous and widespread. Critics and fans pointed out that the only female Avenger was being reduced to a sexual object by her own co-stars, that the joke reinforced the kind of casual sexism that had kept female characters marginalized in superhero films for decades, and that the comments were particularly galling given the ongoing debate about Black Widow's treatment in the MCU, a character who had appeared in 4 films without being given her own solo vehicle. Evans and Renner apologized within days. Evans called his remarks juvenile and offensive. Renner expressed regret. The apologies were accepted by some and dismissed by others as performative damage control. The incident itself lasted only a few days in the news cycle, but it contributed to a larger conversation about the MCU's treatment of female characters that had been building for years and would continue to build. Black Widow had been introduced in Iron Man 2 in 2010, presented initially through the male gaze, her appearance commented on by Tony Stark before her abilities were taken seriously. Her character had been developed significantly over subsequent films, but her solo film would not arrive until 2021, 11 years after her introduction. The Evans-Renner comments were a symptom of a culture that treated female characters as accessories rather than protagonists, even when those characters were performed by one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. The incident also highlighted the fragility of the MCU's public image. The franchise depended on its cast to be ambassadors for the brand, to project warmth and chemistry and good humor in hundreds of interviews and public appearances. When the mask slipped, when the actors revealed attitudes that contradicted the inclusive values the studio marketed, the dissonance was jarring. Evans and Renner were not the studio. They were not speaking on behalf of Marvel. But in the public's mind, they were the Avengers, and the Avengers had just called Black Widow a whore. The Evans-Renner incident was relatively minor in the grand scale of Marvel controversies. The actors apologized, the cycle moved on, but it pointed to something deeper about the MCU's relationship with its female characters, something that goes beyond any single ill-considered joke. Consider the trajectory of Black Widow across the franchise. Natasha Romanoff first appeared in Iron Man 2 in 2010, and her introduction was framed almost entirely through Tony Stark's appreciation of her appearance. She was undercover as a legal assistant, and Stark's first interaction with her centered on how she looked in a tight dress. The camera lingered on her body in a way that communicated exactly how the audience was supposed to regard her, not as a character, as an object of male attention. Over the subsequent films, the character grew in complexity. By Captain America, the Winter Soldier, in 2014, Natasha had been elevated to a co-lead whose intelligence, competence, and emotional depth drove the narrative as much as Steve Rogers's. The Avengers films gave her genuine agency and complexity, but the franchise never gave her a solo film during the period when the MCU was at its commercial peak. Iron Man got 3 films, Thor got 3, Captain America got 3, Black Widow got nothing until 2021, after the character had already been killed off in Avengers Endgame in 2019. Her solo film was a posthumous one, a prequel that could not change the outcome the audience already knew. The decision to kill Natasha, rather than Clint Barton in Endgame, was itself a source of significant fan debate. Both characters traveled to Vormir to retrieve the Soul Stone, and both were willing to sacrifice themselves. Natasha won the argument, throwing herself off the cliff so that Clint could return with the stone. The scene was emotional and well performed, but the optics were difficult to ignore. The franchise's most prominent female character was killed so that one of its least developed male characters could survive. Clint Barton, whose characterization across the franchise had been significantly thinner than Natasha's, was the one who got to go home to his family. Natasha was the one who died on an alien planet, alone, and did not even receive a funeral in the film, a pointed contrast to the elaborate memorial service Tony Stark received. These are not unrelated incidents. The Evans-Renner joke, the delayed solo film, the endgame death, the lack of a funeral, they form a pattern that tells a specific story about how the MCU valued its most prominent female character. Not enough to give her a film while she was alive. Not enough to let her survive. Not enough to mourn her properly on screen. And then, when the film about her life was finally made, not enough to release it in theaters without simultaneously putting it on a streaming platform, which led directly to the lawsuit we discussed earlier. That pattern extends beyond Black Widow. Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, was consistently underwritten across the Iron Man films. Jane Foster was sidelined for nearly a decade. Gamora was killed in Infinity War and then replaced by an alternate timeline version who did not share the experiences and relationships that made the original Gamora meaningful. The MCU has improved significantly in its treatment of female characters in recent years, with films like Captain Marvel, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, and series like WandaVision and Miss Marvel centering women's stories with genuine commitment. But the early years established a debt that the franchise is still repaying. The Evans-Renner incident was minor in isolation, but it was a window into the culture that produced these larger patterns. When the actors who play the Avengers can casually joke about their female colleague being a slut and a whore on camera, and when their first instinct is to laugh rather than to pause, it tells you something about the environment they work in. Not that the environment is hostile to women. The MCU employs and celebrates talented women at every level of production. but that the default setting, the baseline assumption about which characters matter and how, skews male in ways that even the actors have internalized without recognizing it. That is a harder thing to fix than a press tour gaffe. You cannot apologize your way out of a structural imbalance. You can only build your way out of it, project by project, character by character, story by story. And to Marvel's credit, it has been doing that work. The question is whether the work will ever be enough to close the gap entirely. But the Evans-Renner incident would not be the last time that the behavior of individuals associated with the MCU created problems for the brand. And the next instance would be far more serious, with consequences that went beyond bad press and reshaped the entire future of the franchise. Jonathan Majors first appeared in the MCU in the season finale of Loki, which premiered on Disney Plus on July 14, 2021. He played a character known as He Who Remains, a variant of Kang the Conqueror, a temporal being who had maintained the stability of the multiverse by preventing the emergence of his own more dangerous variants. The performance was electric, playful, and menacing in equal measure, and it marked Majors as the actor around whom the next phase of the MCU would be built. Marvel's plan was ambitious. Majors would play multiple variants of Kang across several films and series, just as Josh Brolin had played Thanos across the Infinity Saga. He appeared as Kang the Conqueror in Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, in February of 2023. He returned as multiple Kang variants in Loki Season 2, which premiered in October of 2023, and the fifth Avengers film, initially titled Avengers: The Kang Dynasty, was being developed with Majors as its central antagonist. Kang was supposed to be the next Thanos, the gravity around which the entire multiverse saga orbited. Then, on March 25, 2023, Jonathan Majors was arrested in New York City on charges of assault and harassment involving his then-girlfriend, Grace Jabari. The arrest was followed by months of legal proceedings during which additional allegations of abusive behavior surfaced. Other women came forward with their own accounts. Majors' public image, which had been one of the MCU's most valuable assets, disintegrated in real time. Marvel's response during the months between the arrest and the trial was notably cautious. The studio did not immediately fire Majors. It adopted a wait-and-see approach, monitoring the legal proceedings while quietly developing contingency plans. Quantumania had already been released to disappointing returns, and Loki Season 2 was deep in production and could not easily be restructured. The studio was caught between its investment in Majors as the linchpin of its next decade of storytelling and the growing impossibility of maintaining that investment in the face of the allegations. The trial concluded on December 18, 2023, when a New York City jury found Majors guilty of reckless assault in the third degree and harassment. He was acquitted on other charges, but the guilty verdicts were sufficient for Marvel to act. Within hours of the verdict, Marvel Studios released a statement confirming that it had terminated its relationship with Jonathan Majors. The Kang dynasty was dead. The fallout was enormous. Marvel had built its entire post-Endgame strategy around Kang, and now Kang was gone. The fifth Avengers film was rebranded as Avengers: Doomsday, with a new antagonist. Robert Downey Jr., who had retired from the MCU with Tony Stark's death in Endgame, was announced as the film's villain, playing Doctor Doom. The pivot was dramatic, expensive, and unprecedented. No franchise of this scale had ever lost its central villain midway through a saga and been forced to restructure its entire narrative around a replacement. The Majors controversy raises questions that extend far beyond the MCU. How should studios handle allegations against key personnel? When should a project's dependence on an individual be weighed against the seriousness of the allegations against that individual? Is a wait-and-see approach, which Marvel adopted, the responsible course of action, or does it prioritize the studio's investment over the principle that abusers should face professional consequences regardless of their commercial value? There are no clean answers to these questions. Marvel waited for the legal process to conclude, which is defensible, but it also continued to release Majors' work during that period, which meant that the studio was profiting from the performance of a man who was facing criminal charges. The distinction between separating art from artist and continuing to commercially exploit art made by an artist under criminal indictment is, at best, blurry. What is clear is that the major situation exposed the fragility of Marvel's narrative model. The Infinity Saga worked, in part, because Thanos was played by Josh Brolin, a reliable professional who did not generate negative headlines. The multiverse saga was designed to work the same way, with Kang as the connective tissue. When that tissue was ripped away, the entire structure wobbled, and the scramble to replace Kang with Doctor Doom, however exciting it might be for fans, is an implicit acknowledgement that the franchise's dependence on a single actor for a decade-long narrative arc is a structural vulnerability, not a strength. The Jonathan Majors situation was not the only personnel controversy to rock Marvel in 2023. That same year, another departure sent shockwaves through the company, though it received far less public attention. Victoria Alonso, one of the most senior executives in Marvel Studios' history, was terminated from her position in March of 2023 after 17 years with the company. Alonso had been with Marvel Studios since 2006, before the MCU even existed. She had served as president of physical production, post-production, visual effects, and animation, making her one of the key operational figures behind every MCU film from Iron Man through the Phase 4 releases. Her role was not creative in the way Kevin Feige's was, but it was essential. She was the person who made sure the films actually got made, who oversaw the logistics of production, who managed the relationships with visual effects houses and post-production facilities. Without Alonso, the machine did not run. The official reason for her termination, according to Disney sources, was that Alonso had produced a film called Argentina, 1985 for Amazon Studios, which competed with Disney, and that this violated an employment agreement she had signed in 2022. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best International Feature Film. Disney's position was that Alonso's involvement with a rival studio's production constituted a breach of contract. Alonso's side told a very different story. Her attorney called the contract violation claim absolutely ridiculous and alleged that Alonso had been silenced and then terminated when she refused to do something she believed was reprehensible. Sources close to Alonso suggested that the action she refused to take involved removing overtly LGBTQ+ imagery from a Marvel project, though the specific project was never publicly identified. If this account is accurate, Alonso was fired not for a contract violation, but for refusing to censor queer content, and the contract violation was a pretext. The truth, as is often the case with corporate departures, probably contains elements of both narratives. What is clear is that Alonso's departure was messy, contested, and reflective of internal tensions within Marvel Studios that extended beyond any single individual. The dispute was ultimately settled for what was described as a multi-million-dollar sum, and both parties agreed to a non-disparagement clause that prevented further public discussion of the circumstances. Alonso's departure also intersected with the visual effects working conditions controversy in uncomfortable ways. Some visual effects artists who spoke publicly about their experiences at Marvel described Alonso as a difficult figure, someone who would blacklist artists who had crossed her and who contributed to the demanding culture that burned artists out. Others disputed these characterizations, defending Alonso as someone who fought for resources within a system that was structurally set up to deny them. The conflicting accounts suggest a complex reality in which Alonso was both a victim of the system's pressures and, in some instances, a contributor to them. What the Alonso departure ultimately reveals is that the internal culture of Marvel Studios is more turbulent than its polished public image suggests. The studio presents itself as a creative utopia, a place where the world's best storytellers come together to make magic. The reality, as suggested by the departures, the lawsuits, the working conditions complaints, and the internal conflicts, is considerably messier. That is not unusual for a company of Marvel's size and output. What is unusual is the contrast between the image and the reality, and the extent to which the image has shielded the company from sustained scrutiny. The controversies we have discussed so far have primarily been internal to the MCU, conflicts within the production apparatus of the franchise itself. But some of the most significant controversies in Marvel's history have come from the outside, from voices in the broader culture who looked at what the MCU was doing and said, plainly, that it was not good enough. No external critic has been more prominent or more controversial than Martin Scorsese. In October of 2019, in an interview with Empire magazine, Scorsese was asked about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. His response was measured but devastating. He said he had tried to watch MCU films, but that they were not cinema as he understood it. He compared them to theme parks, sophisticated and well-made theme parks, but theme parks nonetheless. He specifically said that they lacked the quality of conveying emotional and psychological experiences from one human being to another that he considered the essence of cinema. The reaction was enormous and immediate. Social media erupted with defenses of the MCU and attacks on Scorsese. Some fans dismissed him as out of touch, a relic of a bygone era of filmmaking who did not understand the modern audience. Others were more personal, calling him jealous, washed up, or irrelevant. The vitriol was intense enough that other filmmakers who agreed with Scorsese were reluctant to say so publicly, though several did. Francis Ford Coppola went further than Scorsese, calling Marvel films despicable. Ken Loach described them as made as commodities like hamburgers. Scorsese himself was not content to leave the conversation at a soundbite. He wrote an extended essay for the New York Times in November of 2019, in which he elaborated on his original comments. He was careful to note that his criticism was not about the individual talent involved in MCU films, the directors, actors, and craftspeople whom he respected. His concern was structural. The dominance of franchise filmmaking was, in his view, crowding out the kind of cinema that took genuine artistic risks, that explored the human condition with ambiguity and complexity, that did not arrive at a theater pre-sold to an audience of millions. The Scorsese controversy matters not because the director said something shocking, but because he articulated something that many people in the film industry had been thinking but were afraid to say. The MCU's dominance had reshaped the theatrical marketplace. Studios that once took chances on mid-budget dramas and character studies were now allocating their resources to franchise properties with built-in audiences. The number of screens available for non-franchise films was shrinking. The economics of theatrical distribution were increasingly hostile to the kinds of films Scorsese championed. This was not Marvel's fault, exactly. Marvel did not create the conditions that led to the franchise era. It was the most successful expression of a trend that was already underway. But its success had accelerated the trend to the point where alternatives were becoming scarce. And the question Scorsese was really asking, whether a culture that defines cinema primarily through franchise spectacle is a culture that values cinema at all, was a question that the MCU's existence made unavoidable. Marvel's response to Scorsese was notable for its restraint. Kevin Feige disagreed with the characterization but expressed respect for Scorsese and his body of work. Robert Downey Jr. offered a more personal response, noting that he owed his career resurrection to Marvel and that the films had provided genuine emotional experiences for millions of people. James Gunn pushed back more directly, arguing that many great filmmakers had worked within genre constraints and that the distinction between cinema and not cinema was arbitrary and elitist. Ryan Coogler, whose Black Panther represented arguably the strongest counter-argument to Scorsese's thesis, did not engage publicly, which may have been the wisest choice. Individual MCU directors offered varying responses. Some agreed that there was room in the marketplace for both types of filmmaking. Others pushed back more forcefully, arguing that the MCU had produced genuinely meaningful art within its framework. The debate never reached a resolution, because it was never really a debate. It was a collision between two definitions of what cinema is for, and those definitions are irreconcilable. Scorsese was talking about cinema as an art form with specific aesthetic and emotional qualities. Marvel's defenders were talking about cinema as a cultural experience that connects people. Both definitions are valid. Neither encompasses the full reality of what movies are and what they can do. And the argument between them will continue long after both the MCU and Scorsese's filmography have been consigned to history. What is worth noting is that the passage of time has been kinder to Scorsese's argument than many of his critics expected. The MCU's post-Endgame decline in critical and commercial performance has made it harder to argue that franchise filmmaking is immune to the creative limitations Scorsese identified. The sameness that Scorsese saw in the MCU, the predictable structure, the emotional flatness, the prioritization of spectacle over substance, became more apparent as the franchise expanded and the novelty of the shared universe wore off. Scorsese did not predict the specific ways in which the MCU would stumble, but he identified the underlying vulnerability with remarkable precision. And yet, the MCU at its best, the moments when it genuinely achieved something that transcended the formula, the snap in Avengers, Infinity War, the ancestral plane in Black Panther, the therapy scene in WandaVision, the final episode of Loki, these moments suggest that Scorsese's critique, while valid in its broad strokes, may have underestimated the franchise's capacity for genuine emotional resonance. The question is not whether the MCU can produce moments of real cinema. It is whether those moments are the exception or the rule, and whether a system designed primarily for commercial reliability can consistently produce art that matters. That question is still being answered, and it connects to the next controversy we need to discuss, which involves not the MCU's relationship with cinema, but its relationship with the medium that gave it birth, the comics, and a storyline that turned Captain America, the embodiment of American moral idealism, into a secret Nazi. There is a panel in Captain America, Steve Rogers, Volume 1, Issue Number 1, published on May 25, 2016, that lit the internet on fire. In the final pages of the issue, Steve Rogers, the original Captain America, utters two words that contradicted everything the character had represented since his creation by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby in 1941. Hail Hydra. The reveal was that Steve Rogers had been a Hydra sleeper agent all along, his entire heroic career a deep cover operation for the organization that, in the Marvel Universe, is directly descended from the Nazi regime. The character, who had been created by two Jewish American men as a direct response to the rise of fascism, the character whose very first cover depicted him punching Adolf Hitler in the face, was now revealed to be a secret fascist himself. Writer Nick Spencer designed this as the opening move in a long-form storyline that would play out over the following 18 months and culminate in a crossover event called Secret Empire. Spencer's intention was to tell a story about the seduction of authoritarian ideology, about how someone who appears to embody good can be corrupted, about the fragility of democratic values in the face of organized evil. It was supposed to be a cautionary tale. The audience did not experience it that way. The reaction was volcanic. Fans who had grown up with Captain America as a symbol of moral clarity, who had watched Chris Evans embody those values across half a dozen films, were appalled. Social media erupted with condemnation. The phrase "Hail Hydra," trending on Twitter, was surreal and disturbing. Critics pointed out that making a character created by Jewish men into a Nazi was not a subversive act, it was a desecration. Spencer attempted to diffuse the backlash by arguing that Hydra, in the Marvel Universe, are technically not Nazis. This was a distinction that almost no one found persuasive. Hydra's origins are intertwined with the Nazi regime. Their insignia, their ideology, their personnel overlap extensively with the Third Reich, as depicted in the comics and the films. Telling fans that Hydra and Nazis are separate entities was like telling them that water and wetness are unrelated concepts. The controversy escalated as the Secret Empire crossover unfolded in 2017. The storyline depicted a version of America under Hydra's control, with Steve Rogers as its supreme leader. The imagery was deliberately provocative, evoking real-world fascism with a specificity that some readers found irresponsible given the political climate in the United States at the time. The storyline launched in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, a period when concerns about authoritarianism and the normalization of extremist ideology were at a peak. For many readers, a story in which Captain America leads a fascist takeover of America was not provocative fiction. It was a mirror held up at a moment when people were too raw to appreciate the reflection. Tom Brevoort, Marvel's executive editor, later acknowledged that they had been, perhaps, under-concerned about the impact the storyline would have. He received death threats. He canceled a planned Comic-Con appearance due to credible threats to his safety. The controversy had moved beyond the realm of angry tweets and disappointed fans. It had become genuinely dangerous. There is something worth understanding about why this particular controversy generated such intense emotion. Captain America is not just a fictional character. He is a symbol that predates his inclusion in the MCU by decades. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created him in 1941, before the United States had entered World War II, at a time when depicting a superhero punching Hitler was a political statement, not a marketing gimmick. Simon and Kirby were Jewish Americans who understood what was happening in Europe and wanted to use their art to take a stand against fascism. Captain America was their answer. He was born from moral clarity, from the belief that some things are worth fighting for, and that neutrality in the face of evil is itself a form of complicity. To make that character a secret Nazi was not just a narrative twist. It was a repudiation of the creative and moral impulse that brought the character into existence. And for Jewish readers in particular, the betrayal was personal in a way that Spencer and Brevoort appear not to have fully anticipated. The character that their community's creators had built as a weapon against fascism was now a fascist. The symbol that had meant "we are here and we will fight" now meant you cannot trust even the things you thought were safe. Spencer maintained, then and later, that the storyline was always going to end with the real Steve Rogers being restored and the Hydra version being defeated. The point was not to turn Captain America into a permanent villain. The point was to tell a story about how easily the symbols of good can be co-opted by the forces of evil, and about the need for vigilance against authoritarian seduction. These are worthy themes. They are important themes. But the execution, the decision to spend 18 months depicting Captain America as a fascist dictator, the timing relative to real-world political events, and the failure to adequately consider the impact on communities for whom Nazis and fascism are not abstract narrative concepts but lived historical trauma, undermined whatever thematic value the storyline might have possessed. The storyline concluded with the revelation that the Hydra, Steve Rogers, was a manipulation, a version of Rogers created by a sentient cosmic cube named Kobik, who had rewritten his history at the behest of the Red Skull. The real Steve Rogers was eventually restored, and the Hydra version was defeated. The resolution was designed to walk back the premise while preserving the story's themes about the seductiveness of authoritarianism. For some readers, it worked. For many others, the damage was done. The image of Captain America saying "Hail Hydra" could not be unsaid, and the months of stories depicting him as a fascist leader could not be unread. The Hydra Cap controversy is distinct from the MCU controversies we have discussed, because it originates in the comics rather than the films. But it is connected to the broader pattern of Marvel's decision-making in a crucial way. Marvel, as a company, has consistently demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice the sanctity of its characters in pursuit of a compelling narrative hook. The Mandarin twist in Iron Man 3, the Hydra Cap reveal. These decisions are driven by the same impulse, the belief that subverting audience expectations is inherently valuable, that the shock of the twist will generate attention and engagement that outweighs any collateral damage to the character's integrity. Sometimes that bet pays off, sometimes it does not. And the cost, when it fails, is measured not just in angry tweets but in the erosion of trust between a brand and the people who love it. The trust between Marvel and its audience has been tested repeatedly, but perhaps no single event tested it more dramatically than the 48 hours in August of 2019 when it appeared that Spider-Man was leaving the MCU. The Spider-Man situation was unique among Marvel controversies because it was not caused by a creative decision or a personal scandal. It was caused by a contract negotiation between two of the most powerful entertainment companies on Earth. And for a brief, delirious period, it consumed the entire cultural conversation. To understand what happened, you need to understand the history of Spider-Man's film rights. And to understand that history, you need to go back to the darkest period in Marvel's corporate existence. In the mid-1990s, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. The company that had created some of the most iconic characters in American popular culture was financially ruined, and in the scramble to survive, It sold off the film rights to its most valuable properties for amounts that, in hindsight, look like yard sale prices. The X-Men went to Fox. The Fantastic Four went to Fox. Spider-Man, the crown jewel, went to Sony Pictures in 1999 for approximately $7 million. That $7 million deal would haunt Marvel for over a decade. Sony produced Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, which earned nearly $2.5 billion worldwide, and then Mark Webb's Amazing Spider-Man duology, which added another $1.5 billion. Marvel received modest licensing fees from these films, but did not share in the profits in any meaningful way. The most popular superhero in the world was making billions of dollars for someone else. When the Amazing Spider-Man films underperformed relative to Sony's expectations, a window opened. The 2014 Sony Pictures hack, which exposed internal emails, revealed that Sony executives were aware of the quality issues plaguing their Spider-Man franchise and were actively considering options for the character's future. One of those options was a deal with Marvel Studios. The partnership was announced in February of 2015. The terms gave Marvel creative control over Spider-Man's MCU appearances, while Sony retained the distribution rights and the vast majority of the box office revenue. Under the original agreement, Marvel reportedly received only about 5% of first-dollar gross from the Spider-Man solo films, plus all the merchandising revenue. It was not an equal partnership. It was a strategic trade. Marvel got Spider-Man in the MCU. Sony got Kevin Feige's creative guidance, which virtually guaranteed commercial success. The arrangement worked spectacularly. Spider-Man: Homecoming earned $880 million worldwide in 2017. Spider-Man: Far From Home earned over $1.1 billion in 2019, becoming Sony's highest-grossing film ever. Tom Holland became one of the most bankable young actors in Hollywood. Everyone was getting what they wanted. Then the deal expired. In August of 2019, Deadline reported that negotiations between Disney and Sony over a new Spider-Man deal had collapsed. The core dispute was financial. Disney wanted a 50-50 co-financing arrangement, which would give Marvel Studios a much larger share of the box office revenue in exchange for co-financing the films. Sony, which had been receiving the overwhelming majority of the box office under the original deal, refused. From Sony's perspective, Disney was trying to claim a dramatically larger share of profits from a character that Sony owned, using the success that Sony's ownership had enabled as leverage. From Disney's perspective, Kevin Feige's creative leadership was the primary driver of Spider-Man's recent success, and Feige's time and attention deserved commensurate compensation. The announcement that Spider-Man was leaving the MCU triggered a public response that was closer to a cultural emergency than a business story. Fans were distraught. Social media campaigns demanding that the two studios reach a deal went viral. The hashtag Save Spider-Man trended worldwide. Holland himself became a factor in the negotiations. According to reports, he spoke directly with Disney CEO Bob Iger at the D23 Expo and separately with Sony Pictures CEO Tom Rothman, using his personal relationships to reopen lines of communication that had shut down at the corporate level. On September 27, 2019, a new deal was announced. Marvel Studios and Sony had reached a revised agreement under which they would co-produce at least one more Spider-Man film, with Disney receiving roughly 25% of the co-financing and profits, a significant increase from the previous arrangement but well below the 50-50 split Disney had initially sought. Feige would continue as lead producer. Spider-Man would remain in the MCU. The relief was palpable, but the episode revealed how fragile the MCU's foundation could be. The most popular character in the franchise, the character who had appeared on more merchandise than any other superhero on Earth, the character whose image was synonymous with Marvel itself, was there on borrowed time. He existed in the MCU not because Marvel owned him, but because two corporations had negotiated a temporary arrangement that either side could terminate when the economics shifted. The possibility that Spider-Man could be removed from the MCU at any point, disrupting storylines and audience expectations, was no longer theoretical. It had nearly happened, and it could happen again when the current deal expired. The deal that was ultimately struck allowed for the production of Spider-Man: No Way Home, released in December of 2021, which earned $1.9 billion worldwide and became one of the highest-grossing films in history. The film's commercial success strengthened the incentive for both studios to continue collaborating, but it did not resolve the underlying tension. Sony owns Spider-Man. Disney wants Spider-Man. Every negotiation between them is, at its core, a test of how much each side needs the other. So far, the mutual need has been sufficient to maintain the partnership, but the 2019 crisis proved that mutual need has limits, and that those limits are denominated in dollars, not in loyalty to the audience. The fragility of the Spider-Man arrangement also raises a broader question about the MCU's architecture. The franchise is built on the premise of interconnection, of characters moving between films and series in a shared universe. But some of the most important characters in that universe are owned by other companies. Spider-Man belongs to Sony. The X-Men and Fantastic Four belong to Fox until Disney acquired Fox in 2019. The Hulk's solo film distribution rights belong to Universal. These ownership complexities are the tectonic plates beneath the MCU's surface. Most of the time, they are invisible. But when they shift, the entire landscape can change overnight. The Spider-Man deal crisis also exposed something about the audience's relationship with the MCU that is worth examining. The intensity of the public reaction, the genuine distress that fans expressed at the possibility of losing Spider-Man from the Avengers, revealed how deeply the MCU had embedded itself in its audience's emotional lives. These were not casual consumers upset about a product change. These were people who had built a significant portion of their cultural identity around the MCU and its characters, and who experienced the potential loss of Spider-Man as a genuine emotional event. Whether that level of emotional investment in a corporate entertainment product is healthy is a question that extends well beyond the scope of this video. But it is worth noting that Marvel has deliberately cultivated that investment through 2 decades of interconnected storytelling designed to create exactly the kind of attachment that would make losing Spider-Man feel like losing a friend. The Spider-Man deal crisis was the moment when that cultivated attachment became leverage in a business negotiation, when the audience's emotions were, in effect, a bargaining chip played by 2 corporations trying to maximize their respective shares of a multi-billion-dollar pie. That dynamic, the use of audience attachment as a business tool, connects to a broader controversy about Natalie Portman that unfolded across nearly a decade and culminated in a return that was, depending on your perspective, either a redemption or a capitulation. Natalie Portman signed on to play Jane Foster in the original Thor, released in May of 2011, and returned for Thor: The Dark World in November of 2013. Her experience on the sequel was, by all indications, deeply unsatisfying. The departure of Patty Jenkins, whom Portman had personally championed as director, left the actress attached to a project whose creative leadership no longer aligned with her expectations. Jane Foster's role in The Dark World was widely criticized as underwritten, reducing an astrophysicist to a damsel in distress who spent much of the film as a vessel for the ether rather than an active participant in the story. Portman's frustration was palpable in interviews, and she did not appear in another MCU film for nearly a decade. The conventional narrative is that Portman was done with Marvel, that she had walked away from the franchise permanently. The reality appears to be more nuanced. Portman has never explicitly stated that she refused to return, but her absence from Thor Ragnarok in 2017, a film that reinvented the Thor franchise to enormous critical and commercial success, was conspicuous. Her character was written out with a brief line of dialogue explaining that she and Thor had broken up. The woman who had been the love interest of a god was dispatched with a throwaway reference. Then, in July of 2019, at San Diego Comic-Con, Kevin Feige announced that Portman would return in Thor: Love and Thunder, directed by Taika Waititi. Not just as Jane Foster, as the mighty Thor, worthy of Mjolnir, a superhero in her own right. The announcement was greeted with genuine excitement. It suggested that Marvel had listened to the criticisms of how Jane had been treated and was offering a correction. Waititi has said that his pitch to Portman centered on giving her a role that went beyond being the girlfriend. He did not want Natalie back just to stand next to Chris Hemsworth and look concerned. He wanted her to wield the hammer, to fight alongside Thor as an equal, to have her own hero arc. The pitch was based on Jason Aaron's celebrated comic book run in which Jane Foster becomes Thor while battling cancer, one of the most acclaimed Marvel Comics storylines of the 2010s. Portman agreed. Thor: Love and Thunder was released on July 8, 2022. It earned $760 million worldwide, but the critical reception was decidedly mixed. The film struggled to balance its comedic tone with the gravity of Jane's cancer storyline, often undercutting emotional moments with jokes that felt tonally inappropriate. Portman's performance was praised, but the material around her was not always worthy of her commitment. The correction that the film was supposed to represent, giving Jane Foster the role she deserved, was undermined by the film's own inability to take that role seriously enough. Whether Portman will return to the MCU remains uncertain. Her character's arc in Love and Thunder appeared to reach a conclusion, though the post-credits scene left a door open. What is certain is that the Portman saga encapsulates one of the MCU's most persistent problems. The franchise is better at identifying mistakes than it is at fixing them. The recognition that Jane Foster had been poorly served in the Dark World was correct. The execution of the correction in Love and Thunder was imperfect, and the gap between recognizing a problem and solving it is where many of Marvel's best intentions have gone to die. The pattern repeats. The Ancient One was whitewashed. Feige admits it was a mistake. The correction comes years later, in a different film, with a different character. The Mandarin is mishandled. Marvel acknowledges the backlash. The correction comes 8 years later, in Shang-Chi. Female characters are sidelined. Marvel greenlights Black Widow, Captain Marvel, and a female Thor. The execution is uneven. The franchise is always course-correcting, always responding, always adjusting, but the corrections rarely match the scale of the original error, and they always arrive late. There is a specific kind of frustration that comes from watching an organization that is clearly capable of doing better, consistently settle for doing enough. Marvel has the resources, the talent, and the institutional knowledge to avoid these controversies. It chooses, through negligence or indifference or the simple pressure of producing content at an industrial scale, to stumble into them instead, and then it fixes them, partially, belatedly, and moves on. The machine does not stop. But the machine does leave people behind. And no one has been more vocal about being left behind than Rob Liefeld, the man who co-created Deadpool, one of the most commercially successful characters in the MCU's history. Deadpool and Wolverine was released on July 26, 2024. It earned over $1.3 billion worldwide, making it the highest-grossing R-rated film in history and one of the most successful MCU entries ever. The film was a massive victory for Marvel, for Ryan Reynolds, and for Hugh Jackman. For Rob Liefeld, the man without whom Deadpool would not exist, it was something else entirely. Liefeld attended the premiere. He walked the red carpet. He expected to attend the after-party, as he had at previous Marvel premieres. He was told that he and his family were not invited. He posed for professional photographs with members of the creative team, only to be informed later that those photographs had been deleted. He claims that Kevin Feige was near him on the red carpet and did not acknowledge him. Liefeld did not make his grievances public immediately. He stewed. He attempted to resolve the situation through private channels. When those attempts failed, he went public in February of 2025, announcing that he had cut ties with Marvel in all ways. His statement was blistering. He accused Feige of not treating comic book creators well. He described the premiere experience as deliberately humiliating. He framed his departure as a stand on principle, a refusal to accept the disrespect that Marvel, in his view, systematically directed at the people who created the characters that made the franchise possible. Liefeld's complaints did not exist in a vacuum. They connected to a long-running dispute about how Marvel compensates and credits the comic book creators whose work forms the foundation of its film empire. The economic model is simple and, to many, profoundly unfair. Comic book creators, particularly those who worked under the work-for-hire agreements that governed Marvel Comics for decades, typically do not own the characters they create. They receive modest payments, often described as special character bonuses, when their creations are adapted for film or television. These payments are contractual courtesy, not royalties. The scale of compensation bears no relationship to the scale of revenue their creations generate. The numbers are staggering in their disparity. Deadpool and Wolverine earned over $1.3 billion. The creators of those characters, Rob Liefeld and Len Wein respectively, did not share in that revenue in any proportional way. The issue is further complicated by Marvel's decisions about credits. Liefeld's concerns about the Deadpool and Wolverine credits and his closeness to the estate of Len Wein, who died in 2017, reflect a broader anxiety among comic book creators that the company which builds its identity on their imaginations does not adequately recognize or compensate those imaginations. This is not unique to Marvel. It is an industry-wide issue rooted in the work-for-hire system that has governed American comics publishing since its inception. DC Comics has faced similar criticisms from the creators of Superman, Batman, and countless other characters. The estates of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman, spent decades in legal battles with DC over ownership and compensation. The family of Jack Kirby, who co-created the majority of Marvel's most iconic characters alongside Stan Lee, fought a protracted legal battle with Marvel over credit and compensation that was settled out of court in 2014, just as the MCU was reaching its commercial peak. The timing of that settlement, coinciding with the period when Kirby's creations were generating billions of dollars on screen, was not lost on the comics community. But Marvel's unparalleled commercial success with the MCU has made the disparity more visible and more galling than at any other point in comics history. The scale is simply too large to ignore. When a character earns billions and the person who created that character receives a check that would not cover a month's rent in Los Angeles, the injustice is self-evident. When that same creator is not invited to the after-party at the premiere of a film built on their imagination, the injustice becomes personal. The creator rights issue is complicated by the legal reality that work-for-hire agreements, however unfair they may seem, are legally valid contracts. The creators who worked under those agreements knew the terms when they signed them, though many had little bargaining power and few alternatives. The moral argument for better compensation is clear. The legal argument is murkier. And Marvel, as a corporation, has historically relied on the legal framework to justify compensation structures that the moral framework would condemn. Some creators have spoken more kindly of Marvel's practices. Jim Starlin, who created Thanos, has publicly stated that he has been treated fairly by the studio and received meaningful compensation for his creation's central role in the Infinity Saga. Others have been less positive. Ed Brubaker, whose Winter Soldier storyline formed the basis of Captain America: The Winter Soldier, one of the most acclaimed MCU films, described his compensation as not great relative to the film's commercial performance. The experiences vary, but the structural issue remains constant. The system was not designed to share the wealth with the people who create the intellectual property that generates it. The creators are the foundation, the corporation is the building, and the building does not spend much time thinking about its foundation. There is one more controversy that needs to be addressed before we can begin to draw this all together, and it involves an actress whose situation was complicated by the intersection of personal belief, public health, and the enormous commercial pressures of being the face of one of Marvel's most important franchises. Letitia Wright first appeared in the MCU as Shuri, the sister of T'Challa, in Black Panther in February of 2018. Her performance was electric, a burst of charisma and intelligence that made Shuri one of the most beloved new characters in the franchise. When Chadwick Boseman, the actor who played T'Challa, died of colon cancer on August 28, 2020, at the age of 43, the question of Black Panther's future became one of the most sensitive topics in all of entertainment. Marvel ultimately decided not to recast T'Challa, a decision that was itself controversial, and Wright's Shuri became the new Black Panther, in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, released on November 11, 2022. But before that film's release, Wright generated a controversy that threatened to derail the entire project. In December of 2020, she shared a video on social media that questioned the safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines. The video, created by a pastor who had also been accused of sharing transphobic views, promoted conspiracy theories about vaccine ingredients and government overreach. Wright shared the video to her Twitter account, which at the time had millions of followers. The backlash was swift and severe. In the context of a global pandemic that had, by December of 2020, killed over 1.7 million people worldwide, sharing anti-vaccine content was not an abstract ideological statement. It was a public health concern, particularly given Wright's enormous platform and her influence on younger audiences who looked up to Shuri as a role model for scientific brilliance. The irony was painful. Shuri, the character, was a genius scientist who represented the pinnacle of technological innovation. Letitia Wright, the actress, was sharing content that questioned the foundational premises of modern medicine. Wright initially responded defensively, posting a tweet that read, in part, that it was not her intention to make anyone upset and that she was simply asking questions. She subsequently deleted the video and the tweet. But reports emerged that she had continued to share anti-vaccine views on the set of Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, which she denied. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Wright's vaccination status created logistical difficulties for the production when filming moved to locations that required vaccination for entry. Wright eventually broke her extended silence on the matter in an interview with The Guardian, saying she did not hold anti-vaccine or transphobic views and that sharing the video had been a mistake. She distanced herself from the content of the video and expressed regret for the controversy it had caused. Whether this represented a genuine change of heart or a necessary public relations maneuver ahead of a major film release is impossible to determine from the outside. The Wright controversy is the kind of situation that would not have existed 20 years ago, before social media gave every public figure a direct line to millions of people without the intermediary of publicists or studios. The MCU depends on its actors being likable ambassadors for the brand, and the expectation is that those actors will not use their platforms in ways that create controversy for the franchise. When they do, the studio faces an impossible choice. React too strongly, and they risk alienating the actor and the portion of the audience that agrees with them. React too weakly, and they risk appearing to condone views that contradict public health guidance or basic decency. Marvel chose the path of least resistance with Wright. They did not publicly condemn her comments. They did not remove her from the franchise. They waited for the controversy to subside and then released Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, which earned $859 million worldwide. The commercial calculus prevailed, as it almost always does with Marvel. The machine does not stop for controversy. It waits for the controversy to exhaust itself and then continues forward. But the Wright situation points toward a broader and more persistent controversy that has followed the MCU across its entire existence. The franchise's relationship with representation, with whose stories get told and how they get told, has been the source of some of its most celebrated achievements and some of its most painful failures. And nowhere is this more visible than in the MCU's long, halting, deeply contested journey toward LGBTQ+ representation. For the first 13 years of the MCU's existence, there were no openly queer characters in any of its films. Not one. In 23 films spanning from 2008 to 2019, across hundreds of characters and thousands of scenes, queerness was entirely absent. This was not an oversight. It was a choice, one that reflected both the commercial caution of the Perlmutter era and the broader reality that major blockbuster franchises in the 2010s were reluctant to include LGBTQ+ characters for fear of alienating conservative domestic audiences and, crucially, international markets where homosexuality was criminalized or culturally taboo. The first significant acknowledgement of queerness in the MCU came not in a film but in a Disney Plus series. In the third episode of Loki, which premiered on June 23, 2021, the title character, played by Tom Hiddleston, confirmed his bisexuality in a brief exchange with Sylvie, an alternate timeline variant of himself. When asked whether his romantic interests had been would-be princesses or perhaps another prince, Loki responded with a shrug and an acknowledgement that encompassed both. It was a single line of dialogue, delivered casually, without ceremony or emphasis. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The reaction was split along predictable lines. LGBTQ+ fans and their allies celebrated the moment as a meaningful milestone, the MCU's first openly queer major character. The God of Mischief, one of the franchise's most popular characters, was canonically bisexual. That mattered, even if the confirmation was brief. On the other side, homophobic viewers and commentators decried the moment as evidence that Marvel had been ruined by progressive politics, a reaction so predictable in its specifics that it had become its own genre of online discourse. But the more substantive criticism came from within the LGBTQ+ community itself. Loki's bisexuality was confirmed in a single throwaway line and never meaningfully explored. He never had an on-screen relationship with a man. His romantic arc in the series was with Sylvie, a woman, albeit one who was technically a variant of himself. The confirmation felt, to many queer fans, like a checkbox rather than a commitment, the minimum possible acknowledgement that a character could be queer without actually showing queerness on screen in any way that might make conservative viewers uncomfortable or trigger censorship in international markets. This criticism connected to a pattern that Disney had been developing across multiple franchises, the exclusively gay moment in the 2017 live-action Beauty and the Beast, the brief same-sex kiss in Star Wars, the Rise of Skywalker in 2019. These moments were carefully calibrated to be significant enough to generate positive press, but small enough to be easily edited out for distribution in countries where LGBTQ+ content was censored or banned. The term that emerged to describe this approach was queerbaiting, the practice of hinting at queerness to attract progressive audiences without delivering representation substantial enough to constitute genuine inclusion. Eternals, released on November 5, 2021, represented a more significant step. The film featured Phastos, played by Brian Tyree Henry, as an openly gay superhero with a husband, Ben, played by Haz Slayman, and a child. The couple shared a kiss on screen. It was the MCU's first same-sex kiss, and it was not a background moment or a blink-and-you-miss-it gesture. It was part of a domestic scene that established Phastos' family life with the same casual warmth that MCU films had always extended to their heterosexual couples. The consequences were immediate and global. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar banned the film outright because of the LGBTQ+ content. The same-sex kiss and related scenes were censored in the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, and several other countries. Singapore's censor gave the distributor the opportunity to cut the scenes to obtain a lower rating. In each case, Disney and Marvel refused to make the requested edits, which meant that Eternals either did not play or played in censored versions in those markets. This refusal to censor was, in itself, significant. Disney had previously been willing to minimize queer content in its films to preserve access to international markets. The decision to stand firm on the Phastos scenes suggested a shift in the company's calculus, perhaps driven by the growing recognition that LGBTQ+ audiences and their allies constituted a larger and more vocal market segment than the markets being lost. Whether the motivation was principled or commercial is debatable, but the result was real. A major MCU film included a gay character and his family, and Disney accepted the financial consequences of that inclusion. Angelina Jolie, who starred in the film, expressed sadness that audiences in those countries would not be able to see the movie, but affirmed her support for the decision not to censor. Director Chloe Zhao described the inclusion of Phastos' family as non-negotiable from the earliest stages of development. The Eternals ban illustrated a tension that Marvel will continue to face as it expands its representation. Every step toward inclusion generates two opposing reactions: celebration from audiences who see themselves reflected for the first time, and backlash from audiences who view that reflection as an imposition. The MCU exists in a global marketplace where these reactions carry economic weight, where the decision to include a same-sex kiss is not just an artistic choice, but a financial one, with measurable consequences in specific territories. Navigating this landscape requires the kind of moral clarity that the MCU's own heroes are supposed to embody. Whether Marvel has demonstrated that clarity consistently is a question the franchise is still answering. The backlash to LGBTQ+ representation in the MCU was part of a larger phenomenon that came to define the franchise's relationship with a vocal segment of its audience in the late 2010s and early 2020s. The review bombing campaigns that targeted Captain Marvel and She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, represent some of the most visible expressions of this conflict, and they reveal something uncomfortable about the culture that has grown up around the MCU. Captain Marvel was released on March 8, 2019, International Women's Day. It starred Brie Larson as Carol Danvers, the MCU's first solo female lead in a theatrical film. The film was positioned as a significant moment for the franchise, an overdue correction to the 11-year absence of a female-led MCU film, and a critical narrative piece leading into Avengers Endgame. The backlash began before the film was even released. It was triggered, in part, by Brie Larson's public comments about diversity in film criticism. In a speech during her press tour, Larson noted that the critics reviewing major films were overwhelmingly white and male, and she expressed a desire for more diverse voices in the press pool. She explicitly stated that she was not saying she hated white men, but the qualification did not matter. The comments were seized upon by a segment of the internet that interpreted them as an attack on their identity, and the retaliation was swift. Rotten Tomatoes, the review aggregation site, was flooded with negative audience reviews for Captain Marvel before the film had even been released. Users could, at the time, rate their anticipation for upcoming films, and Captain Marvel's want-to-see score was driven down by a coordinated campaign of negative ratings. The reviews themselves were revealing in their language. Users described the film as SJW propaganda, man-hating feminist garbage, and worse. Many of the negative reviews contained no analysis of the film's actual content because the reviewers had not seen it. They were responding to what the film represented, not what the film was. Rotten Tomatoes responded by removing the want-to-see feature entirely, preventing audiences from rating films before their release date. It was a significant policy change driven by the Captain Marvel review bombing, and it acknowledged that the platform's systems had been weaponized for purposes that had nothing to do with film criticism. Captain Marvel went on to earn over $1.1 billion worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing films of 2019. The review bombing campaign had no measurable impact on the film's commercial performance, but it did something else. It established a template that would be repeated for every MCU project that centered a female or minority protagonist. Ms. Marvel, the Disney Plus series that premiered in June of 2022, was review-bombed before its debut. She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, which premiered in August of 2022, received an even more intense campaign. Forbes reported that She-Hulk was getting review-bombed even harder than Ms. Marvel, with one-star reviews appearing on IMDb before the first episode had aired. The reviews followed a now-familiar pattern. The show was described as woke, feminist, political, and extremist. Adult males over 30 were disproportionately represented among the low ratings. The criticism was not about the quality of the storytelling, it was about the identity of the protagonist. She-Hulk was a particularly illuminating case because the show itself addressed the review bombing directly. The series, created by Jessica Gao, featured storylines in which Jennifer Walters, played by Tatiana Maslany, was harassed online by men who objected to a female Hulk being as powerful as the male version. The show incorporated the real-world backlash into its narrative, using the fictional harassment as a mirror for the actual harassment its creators and star were experiencing. This meta-textual approach was polarizing. Some viewers appreciated the show's willingness to acknowledge and critique the toxicity. Others felt it was smugly self-referential and dismissive of legitimate criticism. The review bombing phenomenon raises questions that extend beyond Marvel. The internet has created infrastructure for organized backlash against cultural products that challenge existing power structures. When a franchise as large as the MCU makes a deliberate choice to center stories around women, people of color, or LGBTQ+ characters, It encounters an audience segment that experiences that choice as a loss, as evidence that their franchise has been taken from them. The entitlement underlying this reaction, the belief that a multi-billion-dollar entertainment franchise belongs to a specific demographic, and that serving a broader audience constitutes a betrayal, is not something Marvel created. But it is something Marvel has had to navigate, and the way it navigates it has implications for the entire industry. Marvel's response has been, characteristically, to keep doing what it is doing. It has not retreated from diverse casting or diverse storytelling in response to review bombing campaigns. Captain Marvel got a sequel. She-Hulk completed its run. Ms. Marvel became a character in the Marvels. The commercial calculus once again has been clear. The audiences celebrating representation are larger than the audiences boycotting it. But the toxicity of the discourse has had real costs. Not for the studio, which absorbs controversy the way an aircraft carrier absorbs waves, but for the individuals at the center of it. Brie Larson has spoken about the toll the harassment has taken on her. Iman Vellani, who plays Kamala Khan, has described negative experiences with online hate. The people who make the content bear the brunt of the backlash in ways that the corporation never does. This asymmetry between the corporation's ability to weather controversy and the individual's vulnerability to it is another expression of the core dynamic we have been tracing throughout this video. The machine is protected. The people inside it are not. There is another dimension of Marvel's controversies that deserves its own examination, one that touches on the way the franchise has handled death, legacy, and the question of what happens when a character's actor can no longer continue. The death of Chadwick Boseman and Marvel's response to it represents perhaps the most emotionally complex controversy in the franchise's history. Because unlike most controversies, there is no clear villain, no obvious mistake, and no easy answer. Chadwick Boseman died on August 28, 2020, at the age of 43, after a private 4-year battle with colon cancer. His death shocked the world. Few people outside his immediate circle knew he was ill. He had continued working throughout his treatment, filming Black Panther, multiple Avengers films, and other projects while undergoing surgeries and chemotherapy. The revelation of his diagnosis came simultaneously with the announcement of his death, and the grief was immediate and immense. The question of what to do with Black Panther was one of the most consequential decisions Marvel has ever faced. T'Challa was not just a character, he was a cultural phenomenon. Black Panther, released in February of 2018, had earned over $1.3 billion worldwide and won 3 Academy Awards. It was the first superhero film to be nominated for Best Picture. More importantly, it had become a symbol of Black excellence, a source of genuine pride for communities that had waited decades to see themselves represented as the central heroes of a major blockbuster. T'Challa's significance transcended the MCU. He meant something to people in a way that few fictional characters ever do. Marvel chose not to recast T'Challa. Kevin Feige announced the decision in December of 2020, stating that the role would not be filled by another actor. The character's death would be addressed in the sequel, and the mantle of Black Panther would be passed to another character within the story. The decision was controversial. Some fans and commentators praised it as a respectful tribute to Boseman, arguing that the role was so closely identified with him that recasting it would feel like a betrayal of his legacy. Others, however, argued that retiring the character was actually disrespectful to what Boseman had built. T'Challa was bigger than any single actor, they argued, just as James Bond and Batman had survived recasting. By retiring the character, Marvel was, in effect, saying that T'Challa mattered less than Boseman's portrayal of him, that the symbol could not survive the loss of the man who most recently embodied it. The criticism was sharpened by the implicit comparison to how Marvel had handled previous departures. Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark was retired through an in-universe death that served the narrative. Chris Evans's Steve Rogers was retired through a time travel scenario that allowed the character a happy ending. But in both cases, the character's exits were narrative choices made while the actors were alive and involved. Boseman's death created a different situation entirely. one where the character's future had to be determined not by story logic, but by grief. Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, released on November 11th, 2022, chose to make grief its central subject. The film opened with T'Challa's funeral and devoted its entire narrative to the question of who would carry his legacy forward. Shuri, played by Letitia Wright, ultimately became the new Black Panther. The film earned $859 million worldwide, a strong commercial performance that fell short of the original's record-breaking numbers. Whether Marvel made the right decision is a question that does not have a definitive answer. It depends on what you believe T'Challa represents, to the franchise, to the audience, and to the broader culture. What is clear is that the decision had consequences that extended beyond the immediate sequel. By retiring T'Challa, Marvel foreclosed one of the MCU's most important narrative possibilities: the continued story of a Black king who represented an entire nation and an entire people's aspirations. That story is now over, and the question of whether it needed to be, whether it should have been, will continue to be debated for as long as people care about what these characters mean. The voices calling for recasting were not disrespecting Boseman. Many of them argued that recasting was, in fact, the highest form of respect, because it would acknowledge that the character Boseman brought to life was more than one performance. It was an idea, a possibility, a representation that mattered to millions of people and should not be extinguished because the actor who first inhabited it was gone. Ryan Coogler, the director of both Black Panther films, has spoken about the difficulty of the decision. He chose to honor Boseman's memory through the narrative of Wakanda Forever, but the choice was not simple, and he has acknowledged the validity of the arguments on both sides. The T'Challa debate also raised questions about Marvel's broader approach to recasting. The MCU had already recast significant roles, War Machine and the Hulk, without existential controversy. Those recasts were driven by business disputes, not bereavement, which makes them categorically different. But they established a precedent that characters could survive the departure of their actors. The decision not to apply that precedent to T'Challa was a choice to treat Boseman's role as uniquely irreplaceable, which was either a beautiful tribute or a premature foreclosure, depending on your perspective. What complicates the discussion further is the cultural context. T'Challa was not just any character. He was the first Black superhero to lead an MCU film. He was the first to generate over $1 billion at the box office. He was the first to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. The cultural significance of the character extended far beyond the boundaries of the franchise. Children dressed as T'Challa for Halloween. Adults crossed their arms in the Wakanda Forever salute at protests and celebrations. The character had become a symbol that transcended entertainment, and the decision to retire that symbol affected communities whose relationship with representation in mainstream media had always been precarious. There is no clean answer here. There may never be. But the controversy itself is a testament to the depth of feeling that the MCU can generate, and to the weight of responsibility that comes with wielding that emotional power. When you create characters that mean this much to this many people, every decision about those characters carries consequences that extend far beyond the box office. There is a tendency, when cataloging controversies, to treat each one as an isolated event, a discrete problem with a discrete cause and a discrete resolution. But the controversies we have discussed tonight are not isolated. They are connected by structural forces that operate beneath the surface of any individual scandal or dispute. Pull back far enough and you can see the architecture. The first structural force is scale. The MCU is the largest interconnected entertainment franchise ever attempted. It spans over 30 films, a dozen television series, and countless ancillary properties. It employs thousands of people across multiple continents. It generates billions of dollars in revenue annually. At this scale, controversy is not an aberration. It is a statistical inevitability. Any organization this large, producing content this rapidly, involving this many creative and commercial decisions, will generate conflicts. The question is not whether controversies will occur, but how the organization responds when they do. The second structural force is control. From its earliest days, Marvel Studios has prioritized the franchise's coherence over individual creative expression. This is not inherently wrong. The MCU's interconnected structure is its defining innovation, the thing that separates it from every other attempt at a cinematic universe. But the cost of that coherence is a corporate culture that treats directors, actors, and other creative contributors as interchangeable components rather than irreplaceable artists. When the franchise's needs and the individual's needs conflict, the franchise wins, always. That consistency produces reliable commercial results. It also produces the kind of resentment that erupts in lawsuits, public departures, and bitter interviews. The third structural force is economics. The MCU exists within the Disney corporate structure, which is ultimately accountable to shareholders. Every creative decision, every casting choice, every representation milestone, and every content quantity target is filtered through an economic lens. The question is never just, is this the right thing to do, but always also, what does this cost, and what does it earn? This is not unique to Disney or Marvel. It is the reality of corporate entertainment. But the MCU's unique cultural position, its role as a shared mythology for millions of people, makes the economic calculus more visible and more uncomfortable than it is for most corporate products. When the MCU makes a decision that prioritizes profit over principle, the audience notices, because the MCU has trained them to care about principles through the very stories it tells. The fourth structural force is audience. The MCU's audience is not a passive consumer base. It is an active, vocal, organized community that shapes the franchise's decisions through the volume and intensity of its reactions. Review bombing campaigns influence how studios market their films. Social media outrage accelerates hiring and firing decisions. Fan theories and demands feed back into creative choices. This feedback loop is powerful, but it is not democratic. The loudest voices are not necessarily the most representative, and the pressure to respond to audience reaction can lead to decisions that are reactive rather than considered, that chase momentary sentiment rather than long-term artistic vision. These four forces, scale, control, economics, and audience, interact to produce the specific pattern of controversy that has defined the MCU. Each controversy we have discussed tonight is a product of at least two of these forces working in combination. The visual effects crisis is a product of scale and economics. The director departures are a product of control. The review bombing campaigns are a product of audience dynamics. The representation controversies are a product of all four. The tension between artistic ambition, commercial pragmatism, audience expectations, and the franchise's institutional inertia. Understanding these structural forces does not excuse the specific failures we have documented. It does not make the visual effects artist's suffering less real. It does not make the whitewashing of the Ancient One less harmful. It does not make the erasure of the Maximoff's heritage less troubling. But it does help explain why these things keep happening, why the corrections are always partial and always late, and why the controversies will continue as long as the MCU exists. The MCU is not a person. It does not have a conscience. It does not feel remorse or make moral calculations. It is a system, and systems behave according to the incentives that govern them. If you want the system to behave differently, you have to change the incentives. Higher budgets for visual effects houses, better compensation for comic book creators, more meaningful inclusion of diverse perspectives in creative leadership, genuine accountability when the machine fails the people who run it. Whether those changes will come is an open question. The MCU is too profitable, too dominant, and too deeply embedded in global culture to face the kind of existential pressure that typically drives corporate reform. The controversies create temporary reputational damage that fades when the next blockbuster arrives. The lawsuits are settled. The fired directors find work elsewhere. The review bombers move on to the next target, and the machine keeps running. But there is something worth noting, something that the franchise itself has taught us across 2 decades of storytelling. In the MCU, the heroes who matter most are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones who recognize their mistakes and do the difficult work of correction. Tony Stark does not stop being a hero because he created Ultron. He becomes a better hero because of what Ultron taught him. Steve Rogers does not abandon his principles when the system he serves proves corrupt. He dismantles the system and rebuilds it. The MCU, the corporation, has not yet demonstrated the kind of moral courage that its own characters embody. The gap between the stories Marvel tells and the way Marvel operates is the franchise's deepest and most persistent controversy, the one that encompasses all the others. And closing that gap would require something that no amount of box office revenue can buy. It would require the willingness to prioritize people over product, to treat the human beings who build this universe with the same reverence the franchise extends to the fictional characters who inhabit it. That is the challenge, not for the Avengers, for the people who make the Avengers. And so here we are, having walked through nearly 2 decades of Marvel's most significant controversies, from the casting disputes of the franchise's infancy to the labor crises and cultural reckonings of its maturity. What pattern emerges? The pattern is not one of malice. Marvel Studios is not run by villains. Kevin Feige is not a Thanos figure orchestrating suffering from a golden throne. The people who make decisions at Marvel are, by and large, talented professionals navigating the enormous pressures of maintaining the most successful entertainment franchise in history. They work long hours. They care about the product. They want the films and shows to be good. But the system they operate within has a set of priorities that are, at their core, commercial rather than ethical. The franchise comes first. The brand comes first. The release schedule comes first. Individual people, whether they are actors negotiating fair compensation, directors fighting for creative vision, visual effects artists trying to maintain their health and sanity, or comic book creators seeking recognition for their contributions, are secondary to the machine's continued operation. This is not unique to Marvel. It is the logic of every major corporation in every industry. But Marvel's specific circumstances make the tension more visible and more uncomfortable than most. The MCU trades in stories about heroism, sacrifice, and the power of individuals to stand against systems of oppression. Tony Stark defies the military-industrial complex. Captain America challenges government overreach. The Avengers fight against forces that would reduce humanity to interchangeable units in a cosmic equation. These stories resonate because they speak to values that the audience genuinely holds: the belief that individuals matter, that the powerful have a responsibility to the powerless, that doing the right thing is more important than doing the profitable thing. And then the audience looks at how Marvel treats its visual effects artists, and the distance between the stories and the reality becomes a chasm. This is not a call for Marvel to be perfect. Perfection is not possible for any organization operating at this scale, but it is an observation that the MCU's greatest strength, its ability to tell stories that make people believe in the possibility of a better world, is also the source of its greatest vulnerability. When the company's behavior falls short of the values its stories champion, the hypocrisy is not just noticeable, it is devastating, because it suggests that even the people telling these stories do not believe in them. Not really. Not when money is on the line. There is a scene that comes to mind. It is not from a specific episode or a particular film. It is from all of them. It is the moment when the hero faces a choice between doing what is easy and doing what is right, and chooses right. The MCU has built its entire mythology on that moment. The question, as the franchise moves into its next chapter, is whether the company that produces these stories will ever learn to make the same choice. The controversies are not over. They will never be over. As long as the MCU exists, as long as it employs thousands of people and generates billions of dollars and tells stories that millions of people carry in their hearts, there will be conflicts. There will be firings and lawsuits and creative clashes and cultural reckonings. The machine will keep running. The question is whether it will run over the people in its path or find a way to carry them along. Consider what the MCU looks like from the perspective of different people within its orbit. If you are Kevin Feige, the controversies are obstacles to be managed, problems that threaten the franchise's momentum, and must be resolved as quickly and quietly as possible so that the next film can be made, the next series can be launched, the next chapter of the story can be told. From this perspective, the machine's relentless forward motion is not callousness. It is responsibility. Thousands of jobs depend on the MCU continuing to function. Billions of dollars in investment demand returns. The alternative to the machine is not some utopian creative collective. The alternative is unemployment and bankruptcy, the same bankruptcy that nearly destroyed Marvel in the 1990s. If you are a visual effects artist, the controversies are your life. They are not news stories that trend for a few days and then disappear. They are the 12-hour days and the missed weekends, and the colleagues who break down crying at their workstations. They are the knowledge that the beautiful shots you create, the ones that make audiences gasp and critics praise the filmmakers, were produced under conditions that you would not wish on anyone. They are the feeling of being invisible, of being the foundation that no one looks at because everyone is too busy admiring the building above. If you are a comic book creator, the controversies are the gap between what you built and what you receive for building it. They are the knowledge that the character you dreamed up in a studio apartment, the character you poured your imagination into for a modest page rate, is now the star of a billion-dollar film, and your contribution is acknowledged with a credit that scrolls by in 3 seconds and a check that would not cover a month of the film's catering budget. If you are a fan, the controversies are personal in a way that controversies about other corporations never are. You do not care this much about the internal politics of a car manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company. You care about this because these stories matter to you, because you grew up with these characters, because you see yourself in them, or you want to see yourself in them, or you used to see yourself in them, and you are not sure you do anymore. The controversies threaten something that feels like it belongs to you, even though it does not, even though it belongs to a corporation that would replace you with a different demographic in a heartbeat if the numbers justified it. All of these perspectives are valid, all of them are true simultaneously. And the fact that they cannot be reconciled is what makes the MCU's controversies so persistent and so painful. There is no resolution that satisfies everyone. There is no version of this franchise that makes $28 billion and treats every person involved with perfect fairness, and takes every creative risk, and never offends anyone, and never makes a mistake. That version does not exist. It cannot exist. The scale of the operation guarantees that compromises will be made, and compromises, by definition, mean that someone loses. The answer, so far, has been complicated. It has been uneven. It has been, like the franchise itself, a mixture of genuine greatness and genuine failure, of ambition and negligence, of stories that change lives and decisions that ruin them. The MCU has given the world moments of genuine transcendence. The portals scene in Endgame, the Wakanda Forever salute, the quiet devastation of WandaVision's finale. These moments are real. The joy they bring is real. The communities they build are real. And they exist alongside the overworked artists and the broken contracts and the whitewashed characters and the review-bombed actresses. That is the whole story, not the universe on the screen, the universe behind it, the one made not of infinity stones and vibranium, but of contracts and compromises and human beings trying to make something extraordinary within a system that does not always let them. What stays with you after all of this is not the anger, not the frustration, not the litany of failures and missteps. What stays with you is the recognition that the people behind the MCU are, in the end, just people. They are brilliant and flawed. They are generous and self-serving. They make art that moves millions and decisions that harm hundreds. They are, in other words, exactly like the characters they create. Complex, contradictory, capable of greatness and failure in equal measure. The difference is that the characters get to learn from their mistakes in 90-minute arcs with satisfying resolutions. The people behind the characters have to learn in real time, in public, with billions of dollars and thousands of careers hanging in the balance. The lights are low, the room is quiet. You have been listening to the story behind the story, the universe behind the universe, for a long time now, and what remains is not anger or condemnation, but something closer to understanding. These are the costs of building something this large, this fast, with this many people, and this much money at stake. They are not acceptable costs, but they are real, they are human, and understanding them, naming them, sitting with the discomfort they produce, is the first step toward demanding better. Not perfection, just better. Just the willingness to treat the people who build these worlds with the same care the franchise extends to the worlds themselves. That is enough for tonight. The controversies will still be here tomorrow.